Jon Snow found her crumpled on the hard-packed walkway near the top of the wall. A sharp arrow lodged in her side. Her body was a fragile shape lying against the white drifts, hair a wild spray of red against the snow, blood so bright it looked like fresh berries spilled across new-fallen frost. For a moment, all he could see was her face, drawn tight with pain, her eyes stunned and distant. He thought he'd lost her. Yet even in that haze of desperation, he touched her cheek and felt the faint tremor of life. His first words, whispered close to her ear, echoed against the gloom of night's end. He wanted to say her name, only her name, as if it were a prayer that might keep her alive. His breath rattled with exhaustion, each muscle aching from the fierce fighting that had engulfed Castle Black. When he finally found the voice to speak, what he said was, "Stay with me." He called for help. A few of his brothers in black responded dully, half their number shaken by grief or injury. They cleared a path on the parapets and allowed Jon to carry her down from the top of the wall, stumbling over broken stones and shattered arrows, stepping gingerly around the bodies of fallen men. The whole world felt drenched in sorrow, but he clung to the single thread of hope that she was still breathing, that her life was not yet gone with the bitter wind. The fighting had raged all night, steel clashing, men screaming, the whistling of arrows blackening the skies. Jon could not remember how many times he'd almost died, only that each time, he'd pushed himself further, spurred by duty and desperation. But the moment he saw her collapse, shot from behind, everything else fell away. He became only a man who cared more about one life than the entire war that raged around them. He prayed to the old gods to spare her. When he carried her through the tunnel into Castle Black's courtyard, the battered gates creaked in protest. Only a handful of men still stood, all smeared in blood and ash. The bodies of her own people, the free folk, lay in ragged heaps beside the Black brothers who'd fallen. It wasn't so easy anymore to tell one from the other. Red hair and black cloaks mingled in the colorless gloom of early morning. But the fighting had ended for now. That was the only mercy. Maester Aemon emerged, leaning heavily on his staff. Age had bent his back, but still he bore the weight of his maester's chain with dignity. In his other hand, he carried a small kit of instruments and bandages. After a moment's urging, Aemon led Jon to a small chamber not far from the common hall. It had once been used for storing winter provisions, but it was quiet and relatively clean, a place that could serve as a makeshift infirmary. Jon laid her down on a table. Aemon's ancient eyes were fixed on a point over her shoulder. He could not see, but his hands found their way to her wound by familiarity, brushing lightly over the embedded arrow. He murmured for bandages, for boiling water, for all the simple items of healing that were in short supply at Castle Black. Jon did not leave Ygritte's side. He knelt in the corner, clutching his hands together until his knuckles turned white. He watched, helpless, as the maester bent his head close over the wound. The arrow had gone in deep. Every so often, she would groan, half-conscious, her breath whispering in pained gasps. Jon's heart clenched each time. He thought of all the nights they'd shared beneath the open sky, the flickers of that secret cave with the hot spring, the way her laughter filled the vast emptiness of the Frostfangs with something like joy. He remembered the rough caress of her hands, the teasing lift of her eyebrow whenever she'd said, "You know nothing, Jon Snow." He hoped for one more day, one more chance to hear her speak those words. Hours passed in that bleak chamber, the winds of morning swirling outside the thick walls. A few of Jon's brothers brought news of the aftermath. The wildlings had been thrown back for now, their leader Mance Rayder captured by Stannis Baratheon's sudden intervention. That was the rumor. The would-be King Stannis had come by ship to Eastwatch, marched west along the wall, and trapped Mance's forces between two armies. Jon did not let himself dwell on it. All that mattered was that Ygritte lived. At last, Maester Aemon stood. He was exhausted, pale, and his own breath was ragged, but there was a faint smile on his lips. "She lives," he said simply, gently pressing a folded cloth over the wound he had stitched. "I've taken out the arrowhead. Her heartbeat is strong." Jon rose on unsteady legs, arms trembling. He reached Ygritte's side in 2 strides and pressed his ear close to her chest, hearing the shallow but steady pulse of life. He could have wept, but he had no tears left after the night's slaughter. "She will need rest," Eamon said. "Her wound could fester if we are not careful. I have precious little in the way of medicine, and we have many wounded. But I will do my best, Lord Snow." Jon half smiled at the title. "I'm not lord of anything," he murmured. "Only a steward, a sworn brother of the Night's Watch." Eamon gave the slightest shake of his head. "You are needed, Jon Snow. The battle is not finished." Then he sighed. "Do not leave her for too long, but you must go see to the living as well as the dying." Jon reached for Ygritte's hand and squeezed it gently. She murmured something, too low for him to catch. Her lashes fluttered but did not open. He brushed a light kiss on her brow, then turned and left the room, vowing to return as soon as he could. Outside, the sky was a pale gray that signaled a day weighed down by sorrow. The courtyard was a ruin of broken wagons, scattered weapons, and lumps of snow stained red. Brothers huddled in small groups around fires or stood watch at the walls, scanning the horizon for another wave of wildlings. But word had spread that the battle was over for now. Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall, had been taken captive. There might still be stragglers, but the great host was leaderless. Jon worked through the day, hauling bodies to pyres, gathering men to sort the living from the dead. The Night's Watch had suffered heavy casualties, and the free folk had lost even more. He helped the wounded find spaces in the common hall. Maester Eamon and a few others did their best, but there were not enough hands to treat everyone. Outside the gate, Stannis's men had marched from Eastwatch, bringing fresh horses and strong arms, but also a sense of foreboding that unsettled Jon. He could see them occupying the area beyond the wall, a foreign force in dark armor, bearing the fiery heart of the Lord of Light on their banners. Their presence reminded him that new battles, new alliances, might be forced upon him. The North was in chaos, the realm was in open war, and the White Walkers were still the true threat on the horizon. It was nearly nightfall before Jon managed to slip away. He returned to the dimly lit storeroom that served as the infirmary. The air was heavy with the scent of blood and herbs. A few wounded brothers dozed fitfully on pallets along the walls, moaning in their sleep. But Jon's gaze was drawn immediately to the table at the end, where Ygritte lay still, her face ashen but her brow no longer beaded with sweat. He lowered himself onto a small stool at her side and took her hand once more. Gently, he whispered her name. Her eyes flickered open, pale green in the lantern light. She blinked, confusion clouding her features. Then recognition flared. "Jon," she rasped, voice barely above a whisper. "Still alive, are you?" He exhaled in something like relief. "So are you," he said. "The maester saved you. There was an arrow." She nodded faintly, her head sinking back onto the makeshift pillow. "I remember. I was aiming at a crow up on the walkway. Then, burning pain in my side. Must have been one of your archers." Her voice was tinged with weariness, but there was still that sharp edge to it, the fierce spirit that had once warmed Jon's blood. Jon brushed a strand of red hair away from her cheek. "I'm sorry." For a time, neither spoke. The hush of the infirmary was broken only by the faint crackle of a torch in the corridor. Finally, Ygritte shifted, wincing. "The fight's over," she said. It was not a question. Her eyes, glassy with pain, flicked across his face. "Yes, Mance Rayder was taken captive by Stannis Baratheon," Jon told her. "Stannis calls himself the rightful king of Westeros. He wants the North under his banner. Your people have scattered, but many are outside the gates still, some wounded, some in hiding. Nothing is truly over." She squeezed his hand with an unexpected burst of strength. "I can't fight yet," she said bitterly, "but I can still talk. They'll need me for that, I reckon. The free folk won't yield easily. We lost Mance, but we haven't lost our will." Jon bowed his head, feeling the tension that lay before them. He recalled the words he'd shared with Mance before all this began. Something about the greater enemy, the White Walkers, He remembered how he'd tried to persuade his brothers that forging an alliance with the Free Folk was their best chance at survival. It had ended in blood and death. Yet if there was still any chance to achieve that unity, perhaps Ygritte's voice could help where his had failed. "I hope you can stand soon," he murmured. "We need your counsel." A faint smile ghosted across her lips, and for a moment he saw the young woman he'd once sheltered in that cave, the one who had teased him, tested him, and loved him. "Don't you go counting me out yet, Jon Snow," she said. "A little arrow won't stop me from speaking my mind." He clasped her hand tighter, saying nothing, and let the tension of the day melt into the quiet comfort of her presence. He would have to speak with Stannis, with the remaining watch officers, with the Free Folk who might still follow Mance Rayder's cause. Yet in that moment, he allowed himself to remain by her side, a reminder that in all the darkness of this world, there was at least one person who anchored him to hope. She was still too weak to rise the next day, or the next. But each morning, Jon returned to check on her, to report the day's events, to share a small smile over the madness of their situation. In those first few days, tension simmered around Castle Black as Stannis's men took up position, overshadowing the battered remnants of the Watch. Mance Rayder was imprisoned deep within the ice cells, and rumors flew about what punishment might be visited upon him. Would Stannis burn him alive, as the Red Priestess who traveled with him was rumored to demand? Would he be executed as a warning to the Free Folk? Jon's nights were sleepless. He still carried the weight of the oath he had sworn to the Night's Watch. And yet, with Ygritte's life hanging in the balance, he felt torn. He was no stranger to such conflicting loyalties. He had once been a spy among her people, only to discover that he could no longer betray them. Despite the bloodshed, he felt that an alliance with the Free Folk remained crucial if they were all to survive the gathering storm of winter and the White Walkers. At last, Ygritte mustered the strength to stand. Jon was there, arms outstretched. As she pushed herself up from the makeshift bed, she hissed through gritted teeth. Her side was still bandaged, and her face was pale, but she rose, leaning on him, pride flickering in her eyes. "Help me dress," she muttered. "I can't go meeting kings in a half-torn shift." Jon searched for a spare shirt and breeches among the supplies. The Black brothers had no women's garments, and Free Folk clothes were hardly in better condition. In the end, she settled on a thick wool tunic that hung loosely, cinched at the waist by a belt. She made no complaint beyond an annoyed grunt. Her hair was matted, but she roughly gathered it back. When they emerged into the courtyard, the sky was overcast. Stannis's red banners snapped in the cold wind, and the men of the Watch looked strained, uncertain. Many watched from the sidelines as Ygritte, leaning on Jon's arm, made her way slowly toward the table set up for war councils near the base of the wall. A large tent had been erected there, a show of the king's authority. Davos Seaworth, the Onion Knight, stood outside, greeting them with courteous nods. He stepped aside to announce them to Stannis, who was seated behind a table studying a map of the north. Beside Stannis stood Melisandre of Ass High, her red hair as startling as Ygritte's own, though darker in hue. Her eyes were unsettling, brimming with some secret knowledge. On Stannis's other side were a few lordlings and knights Jon barely recognized. They fell silent as Jon and Ygritte approached. Stannis looked up. His face was stern, carved from granite. "Jon Snow," he acknowledged. Then his gaze moved to the woman leaning on Jon's arm. He frowned faintly, perhaps surprised that she yet lived. "I remember her from the battle." Jon steadied Ygritte as she spoke, her voice as clear as she could manage. "I'm Ygritte," she said, meeting the king's cold gaze head-on. "Free Folk, a spear wife." She gave an upward jerk of her chin. "Used to follow Mance Rayder. He wanted us safe from the dead that walk." Stannis's mouth pressed into a line. "Mance Rayder is in my custody. It was his choice to rise in arms against the realm. He will face justice." "You don't understand," Ygritte retorted, eyes burning. "We never wanted your castles or your iron chair. We only knew what we had seen. The White Walkers are coming. Your wall is the only thing that keeps the dead from devouring us all." John felt a jolt of tension in the air. Melisandre tilted her head curiously, her red robes shimmering with the slightest movement. "The Lord of Light has shown me visions," she said in her soft voice. "A great darkness rolling from the north. The free folk's stories of wights and walkers are not without truth." Stannis drummed his fingers on the table. "So I've been told. Yet here we stand, with thousands of your people scattered outside the wall, prone to raiding and further bloodshed." He turned his harsh gaze on Ygritte. "If you wish them spared, you will bend the knee to the one true king and swear fealty. Then we shall see how best to deal with the coming threat." Jon sensed the anger rippling through Ygritte. The free folk did not kneel. That was their proudest tradition. He placed a hand gently on her arm, a subtle warning. But Ygritte's face was already set, her jaw clenched. "We have no king," she growled. "We bend the knee to no one. You may have chained Mance, but you won't chain us all." Stannis' stare hardened. The atmosphere in the tent bristled with tension. Jon stepped forward, his voice carefully measured. "Your Grace, the free folk will never kneel. It's against everything they believe. But they also want to live. They want peace and they want shelter from the White Walkers. If you give them land south of the wall, or allow them to pass without harm, many of them would be willing to stand with you against the undead." "They are a savage people," declared one of the lordlings. "They raid and pillage the north." Ygritte fixed him with a glare. "We did what we must to survive. We've lost our homes already, to the ice and the dead." She paused, swallowing. "We're not your enemies by choice. We were forced to fight because your wall has kept us from escaping the horrors beyond." Stannis considered her words. Then he gave a curt nod. "I am no fool. I know the threat is real. But the North must be brought to heel, and the free folk cannot simply cross into the Seven Kingdoms as they please. I have men who remember burned villages in the gift." Jon heard the tension in Stannis' voice. The man wanted an oath of loyalty. But the free folk's loyalty could only be earned by mutual respect, not demanded by feudal law. Jon recalled the lessons he had learned with Ygritte in the wild, the sense of camaraderie that came from surviving together, the fierce independence that guided them all. He took a breath and spoke calmly. "We are at an impasse. The free folk will not kneel, but they can show their good faith in other ways. Let them help us hold the wall. Let them fight alongside your men, your Grace. If they refuse, punish them accordingly. But give them a chance to prove themselves before condemning them." Melisandre's red lips curved in a slight smile as she watched Jon, her strange eyes flickering with interest. Stannis tapped the table once, gazing at Jon with undisguised scrutiny. "The Night's Watch are meant to remain neutral," he said, "and yet you speak for these wildlings as though they are your own." "Why?" "Because I know them," Jon answered. "I traveled with them. I ate at their fires, heard their stories. They're people, same as us, desperate to survive. If we turn them away, we will only weaken ourselves. The real war is yet to come. When the White Walkers march on this wall, we will need every sword, every arrow." Stannis' expression was stony, but he gave a brief nod. "Very well. Davos, see that envoys go out to the free folk camps. Offer them this truce. They will be allowed south of the wall, given land to farm in return for service in our war. If they reject it, the consequences will be swift and brutal." Ygritte's eyes narrowed. She dipped her chin, a small acknowledgement that perhaps this was better than nothing. She did not speak, but she looked at Jon with something that might have been gratitude, or perhaps relief. They left the tent soon after, battered by the weight of the king's demands. Outside, the wind had kicked up a stinging spray of snow. Ygritte leaned heavily on Jon, breathing slowly. "He's asking too much," she muttered. "But we have no choice." Jon nodded. "At least he's granting a chance. If the free folk accept, they can move south peacefully. If not..." He let the words trail off. She grimaced. "They'll see him as just another Kneeler King, a man who wants them to bend. It's not in our nature." Jon considered that. "You once told me when you love someone you have to be willing to break the rules." Maybe it's time for the free folk to choose survival over pride. Ygritte's lip curled in a half-smile. You know nothing, Jon Snow. But her tone was almost affectionate. In the days that followed, Ygritte insisted on helping despite her wound. She could not ride yet, but she met with the free folk who had ventured close to the gates, forming small knots of survivors. Many were women and children, the men lost in the battle or still wandering the wilderness. Ygritte spoke with them quietly, explaining what was being offered, the cost of acceptance. She did not lie. She told them plainly that Mance was a captive, that Stannis wanted them to serve his cause. Some spat at the idea, calling it a betrayal. Others, eyes hollow with hunger and loss, asked only if it would keep them alive. Ygritte urged them to consider it. Jon's brothers in the Watch looked on with suspicion, though a few had begun to see reason. Samwell Tarly, in particular, offered moral support, gleaning what he could from old records about the lands known as the Gift. Farmland that once belonged to the Night's Watch but had long gone untended. If there was land to be given, it might be found there, in that broad swath south of the Wall. But that would require the North's cooperation, and the North was fractured. The Boltons held Winterfell in the wake of the Red Wedding, while loyal Stark supporters were in disarray. Still, a semblance of a plan took shape, and Ygritte, with her fierce spirit and direct honesty, became a crucial advisor. The free folk who recognized her name or face listened. They remembered her skill with a bow, her unwavering loyalty to her people. Some began to trust in this uneasy arrangement. They might not kneel, but they would move south. They would fight the coming war, and perhaps in time they would forge a place for themselves that did not require them to cower in the frozen wastelands beyond the Wall. Amid the negotiations, Jon and Ygritte found fleeting moments of calm. Late in the evening, when both were weary, they would share a small meal by the embers of a dying fire. They talked in hushed tones about the heartbreak of war, about how different things might have been if the realm had recognized the danger beyond the Wall sooner. They rarely spoke of the cave they had once shared, or the tender intimacy they had known away from all the violence. But sometimes Jon would catch her eye, and she would smile, a private memory flickering between them. One night, after too many hours of talk and worry, she reached over and took his hand. "I'm glad you survived," she said quietly. "I always told you I'd kill you if you betrayed me, but I'm glad I never had the chance." Jon couldn't help but laugh, a low, weary sound. He turned her hand over, marveling at the calluses on her palm. "You almost did more than once. Guess I'm lucky." She snorted softly. "You always were." Their stolen warmth in those quiet hours gave both of them a measure of strength. The days were hard, but more and more free folk straggled to the Wall, drawn by the rumors of a chance to survive. Jon and Ygritte guided them through the gates under the watchful eyes of Stannis's men. Some nights, fires burned outside as more arrived, uncertain whether to trust the crows. But word spread quickly. The Red King was offering land, if you only pledged to help fight. They all knew an even bigger threat loomed beyond the far horizon, though the free folk would not speak of it too loudly, fearing it might hasten its arrival. At length, news arrived that the Boltons were tightening their hold on the North. They had declared themselves the Wardens of the North under King Tommen in King's Landing. The lords loyal to the Starks had either been destroyed at the Red Wedding or had gone into hiding. Stannis, itching to press his claim, insisted on marching south before winter made movement impossible. He demanded that Jon accompany him, to help rally the northern houses, or at least to keep the free folk in line if they began to rebel. But Jon could not leave the Wall easily. The Night's Watch needed leadership after the losses they had suffered, and tradition dictated they choose a new Lord Commander. Several of the surviving officers cast suspicious glances at Jon. They whispered that his loyalties were divided. Others had come to admire his dedication, especially after seeing him work to save as many as possible during the battle. Sam, in his earnest way, tried to explain to the reluctant brothers that Jon Snow would be the best commander for these changing times, for he understood both the free folk and the realm to the south. Ygritte, meanwhile, found herself caught in the swirl of these decisions. She knew the free folk would not trust Stannis's men blindly, not when so many had died by southern steel. She also knew that if Jon left, their fragile arrangement might collapse. If Jon stayed, then Stannis might well march off and treat the free folk as expendable. The swirl of political demands made her bristle with frustration. "This is what your kneelers do," she groused to Jon one night. "They talk and talk, while the real enemy crawls closer." Jon sighed, resting a hand on Longclaw's pommel. "I know, but if we can keep them talking instead of fighting, maybe that buys us time." "Time for what?" she asked, arching a copper eyebrow. "To prepare for winter," he said grimly. "We need to gather supplies, recruit anyone who can wield a weapon, forge alliances. The White Walkers don't care about kings or crowns. They only bring death." Her gaze grew distant, as though seeing again the horrors that drove them from the far north. "I don't want to see more people die," she admitted softly. "We've already lost so many." Then she set her jaw. "I'll talk to the free folk. Some follow Tormund Giantsbane, some follow Rattleshirt, some are little bands of raiders. But if they can see a chance to fight back, they might unite. Can help, Jon. If you promise me that your brothers won't stab us in the back." Jon looked into her fierce eyes and nodded. "I promise." The next day brought another council. The surviving officers of the Watch convened, joined by Stannis and his key retainers. Ygritte, still sporting her bandage, sat quietly near Jon, casting fierce glances around the room whenever someone spoke ill of the free folk. The council was tense. Stannis wanted the Watch's support for an immediate march on Winterfell to wrest it from the Boltons. The Watch, by oath, was meant to remain neutral in the wars of the realm. Some officers insisted they must refuse Stannis outright, while others worried that without Stannis' support, they would not have the resources to hold the wall against the undead threat. Jon stood near the head of the table, arms folded, thinking back to all he had learned at the feet of Maester Aemon and Jeor Mormont. Duty was the death of love, the old bear had once said. But duty and love both commanded Jon in this moment, pulling him in conflicting directions. He remembered Ygritte's near death. He remembered the free folk's desperation. He recalled his father's words about honor, how the right path was often the hardest. Finally, he spoke. "We cannot march south. Our oath prohibits it. We must defend the wall, that is our prime duty. But we need allies in the north if we're to gather supplies and men. The free folk can help hold the wall from the northern side, if we let them, but they can't do it alone. Stannis wants to attack Winterfell, and that might serve us in the long run if the Boltons are driven out. Still, the Night's Watch cannot declare openly for one king over another. We can't break 8,000 years of tradition now, not even for this cause." Stannis scowled. "Are you telling me you will refuse me, Snow?" "I'm saying the Watch cannot fight your war," Jon said carefully. "But individuals might. There are men in the Watch who committed no crimes, who joined the Watch willingly, who might choose a different path if their vow is absolved. But that vow cannot be absolved lightly, and the Watch as a body must remain." Ygritte, from her corner, watched Stannis' face darken. She could see he was a man of iron convictions, not easily swayed by nuance. She glanced at Jon, uncertain how this would play out. Suddenly, Stannis snapped his gaze around the room. "Then perhaps you need a new Lord Commander, one who will see sense. One who understands that the threat of the White Walkers demands we unify the North under my banner." His eyes flicked to Jon, as though weighing some unspoken possibility. Some officers bristled. Ser Dennis Mallister, one of the candidates for Lord Commander, cleared his throat. "Your Grace, choosing our Lord Commander is an internal affair of the Night's Watch." Stannis did not bother to hide his irritation. "The Night's Watch has always been vital to the realm's defense. I mean to see that it remains strong enough to fulfill that purpose." Melisandre watched silently, her red eyes lingering on Jon. She seemed almost amused, as if she perceived a hidden destiny swirling around him. Ygritte felt a sudden chill in her bones. She did not trust the Red Priestess, with her cryptic talk of visions and sacrifices. In the days that followed, debates raged. Stannis insisted that the Boltons must be overthrown. He offered pardons and honors to any Northmen who joined him. Word spread among the free folk as well. Some saw opportunity, while others scoffed at the notion of bowing to a foreign king. The senior officers of the Watch prepared to hold an official choosing for the next Lord Commander. Jon tried to remain neutral, but rumors spread that Stannis favored him. That soured many in the Watch who mistrusted outside interference. Others, spurred by Sam's tireless campaigning, believed that only Jon Snow could handle the delicate balance between the free folk, the Watch, and the newly arrived forces of the so-called King Stannis. Ygritte stayed mostly among the free folk who had gathered near Castle Black in makeshift camps. She moved among them, speaking quietly with chieftains and spearwives, convincing them that this uneasy alliance was their best chance for survival. Some spat at the mere mention of Stannis. Others were more open, especially families with children who needed shelter. Ygritte's wound still troubled her, twinges of pain flaring whenever she twisted too quickly, but she refused to remain idle. "I can't just sit and wait," she told Jon one evening, after returning from a long day of negotiations. "We have to hold them together. If they slip away, we'll lose everything." Jon squeezed her shoulder. "I know. We're so close to forging something that could last. But there are too many old grudges. Too many new fears." She pressed her lips into a thin line. "They trust me more than they trust you crows, and I'm still not sure how I feel about that black cloak of yours." Jon gave her a wry smile. "I don't blame you." In the end, the Night's Watch gathered for the election of their new Lord Commander. The senior officers stood in the courtyard with torches lit, a ragged circle of black cloaks. Stannis and a handful of his knights stood off to one side, observing but not interfering. Ygritte watched from a vantage point near the gates, arms folded. She did not entirely understand their process, but she knew it would shape Jon's future, and hers. Sam read out the names of the candidates, the leading ones being Ser Dennis Mallister, Cotter Pike, and Jon Snow. Each brother in attendance received a token they would cast to indicate their choice. Whispers skittered through the crowd as men debated in hushed tones. Some favored the older, more experienced Mallister. Others respected Cotter Pike's long years of service. But many saw Jon Snow as a bridge between worlds, the one man who had proven able to stand with the free folk and still remain loyal to the Watch. The tokens were cast into bowls, and the tension in the courtyard was palpable. When the count was completed, Maester Aemon, trembling with age, announced the result in a clear, steady voice. "The 998th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch shall be Jon Snow." A hush fell over the courtyard, broken only by scattered murmurs. Sam beamed. Stannis inclined his head, expression unreadable. Ygritte watched from her spot by the gate, lips pressed together in a silent smile that spoke of proud surprise. Jon stood in the center of it all, face pale, his eyes reflecting a swirl of emotions. Anxiety, resolve, maybe even fear. Duty weighed on him immediately, as he stood before his brothers, who chanted his name in a ragged chorus. He thought of the vow he had taken, to be the shield that guards the realms of men. He felt that vow echo in his heart, reminding him of the near-impossible task he now faced. The next morning, he met with Stannis in the king's makeshift solar. Davos was there, along with Melisandre. Ygritte attended as well, standing at Jon's shoulder, for both of them had decided that from now on, the free folk would have a voice at any council that involved them. Stannis wasted no time. "So, Lord Commander Snow, will you support my campaign against the Boltons?" Jon did not flinch from the king's intense gaze. "I cannot commit the Night's Watch to fight your war. We have our own war to prepare for here at the Wall. But some of my brothers might join you if they so choose, though that would mean leaving the Watch." Stannis grimaced, but he said nothing. Davos cleared his throat. "We need the North, my Lord Commander. We need the loyalty of the free folk, or at least their neutrality. You claim they'll help hold the Wall if we provide them land. Is that correct?" Jon nodded. "Yes, many have already agreed, so long as they're not forced to kneel. They'll farm the lands of the gift and bolster our defenses. In return, they want safe passage and a promise not to be harried by your knights." He glanced briefly at Ygritte, who inclined her head in agreement. Stannis folded his arms. Very well. If that is what it takes to keep the free folk from scattering back into the wilds, so be it. But I expect them to remember that this allowance comes from me, the rightful king of Westeros. Ygritte gave him a cold stare. They won't kneel, she repeated. I do not require their kneeling, Stannis replied curtly. Only their cooperation. A moment passed. Jon ventured. There is another matter. Mance Rayder. Stannis stiffened, and Melisandre's eyes flashed. Mance Rayder is a traitor, she said softly. He plotted to bring down the wall, to open the realm to the White Walkers. He wanted to bring his people south. Ygritte broke in, anger simmering in her tone. The rest might not follow if you kill him. He's still a symbol. Stannis flicked a glance at Melisandre. He refuses to bend the knee. He has named me no king. He scorns the Lord of Light. The Red God demands justice. Jon took a measured breath. If you execute Mance, you might spark revolt among the free folk. They respect strength, but they also respect those who fought for them. He's more than a man. He's a living legend. If you burn him, you risk turning thousands of potential allies into sworn enemies. Stannis's jaw worked. I will consider, he said at last. But my patience is not infinite. Speak to Mance yourself if you wish. Try to convince him to relent or to show a token of respect. I would prefer not to make a pyre of him, but I cannot abide open defiance. Jon nodded, feeling some measure of relief that Stannis was at least willing to listen. Ygritte's face remained tense. He won't kneel, she said, but maybe there's something else he can do. When they emerged from the solar, the corridors echoed with the wind outside. Winter was closing in around them, each day shorter, the nights colder. They walked slowly through the passageway toward the icy cells where Mance was kept. Ygritte had to pause once, pressing a hand to her side, pain flickering in her face. Jon's concern rose, but she shook him off and continued on. I've survived worse, she muttered. At last they reached the guarded door. 2 of Stannis's soldiers stood watch, halberds in hand. Jon told them that the king had allowed him to speak with the prisoner. They grunted and let them through. Inside, Mance Rayder sat on a low stool, wrists chained to the floor. He had lost weight, and there were bruises on his face, likely from rough handling. Still, his eyes were bright with that sardonic edge that Jon remembered well. He glanced up and let out a ragged laugh. Well, if it isn't Lord Snow, he said mockingly. Or should I say Lord Commander Snow? Word travels even in here. And Ygritte, alive and well. That's the first good news I've had in a while. Ygritte knelt in front of him, her voice soft. Mance, they mean to burn you if you don't give them something. He looked at her, his expression a mix of fondness and regret. There's nothing I can give them, he said quietly. I'll never bend the knee, but I did what I set out to do. My people crossed the wall, or at least enough of them did that we might still have a future. Are they being spared? Jon nodded. For now. Stannis offers them land in the gift, if they'll fight the White Walkers alongside the Watch. Some have agreed. Mance considered. Good. Then my time wasn't wasted. He shifted his shoulders, chains clinking. If he wants a pledge, I have none. My only cause is the safety of my people. Ygritte's eyes flicked to Jon. We have to find a way, she urged. He's not going to kneel, but maybe you can show them you'll fight for the living. Tell them you'll serve in your own way. Mance's lips twitched in a half-smile. They want a show. They want me to plead for mercy. Well, I was never much good at pleasing kings. I served in the Watch once, Jon Snow. Did you know that? Jon nodded. Yes, I know. You deserted. You saw the free folk not as enemies, but as people. Mance tilted his head. Indeed, and for that I was branded a traitor. Now they'll brand me a traitor again because I won't bend to this southern king. So be it. Jon suppressed a frustrated sigh. Is there no middle ground? Swear something, anything, that you won't seek to bring the wall down again, that you'll help protect the realm from the White Walkers, that you'll stand by while your people settle the gift. Make it a vow to the living, not to a king. Maybe that will satisfy Stannis. The king beyond the wall was silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, "I would vow to fight the dead, to protect my people, and to spare the realm further bloodshed. That is not a vow to any king, but to life itself. If Stannis is wise, he'll accept it." Ygritte touched his chained hands gently. "I'm sorry." He gave her a tired smile. "You've done well, lass. You're alive and our people might live. That's all I ever wanted." They left him there behind the iron bars. That same evening, Jon relayed Mance's offer to Stannis. The king ground his teeth, and Melisandre pressed for an execution to show the power of R'hllor. But Davos and Jon argued that Mance's vow, while not fealty, was still a concession. In the end, Stannis grudgingly allowed Mance Rayder to live, under the watch of guards, of course, and agreed to a public ceremony in which Mance would declare his opposition to the White Walkers. The ceremony was stark and brief. In the courtyard of Castle Black, torches lit the gloom as Mance Rayder, hands unshackled, stood before the king's men and free folk alike. He raised his voice, cracked with fatigue, to say he would fight for the living, that his true enemy had always been the White Walkers, not the southern realms. He did not speak the words, "Your Grace," nor did he kneel, but he gave his pledge to stand against the undead threat and to guide his people in that struggle. Some of Stannis's men grumbled that this was no real submission, but Stannis himself listened in cold silence, then gave a curt nod. Mance Rayder was placed in a guarded chamber rather than a dungeon cell, forbidden from leaving Castle Black until the war began in earnest. The free folk, seeing their king beyond the wall spared, felt a surge of relief. Ygritte exhaled a breath she had been holding for days, so the uneasy alliance took shape. More free folk poured in, grateful for shelter. They accepted parcels of land in the gift, though they left them largely unattended for the time being, uncertain how best to farm or whether they would truly be safe there. Stannis drilled his men and sent out envoys to the northern lords, hoping to rally them to his cause against the Boltons. The Night's Watch worked tirelessly to strengthen the wall's defenses, to gather dragonglass weapons rumored to be deadly to White Walkers, and to prepare for the harsh winter to come. In the midst of this flurry, Jon was officially installed as Lord Commander. He stood before the Black Brothers, reciting the words he'd once spoken as a boy, the vow that had bound him to the wall forever. Now he bore that responsibility on his shoulders, feeling the enormity of it in every breath. Yet when he looked out across the courtyard, he saw Ygritte leaning against a post, her gaze steady and proud. He allowed himself a faint smile. He had not chosen this path lightly, but it was the path he believed in. Together, they would forge a new beginning, if fate allowed. Time slipped by in a haze of negotiations and preparations. Ygritte spent much of her days among the free folk, ensuring that conflicts with Stannis's knights or the Watch did not flare into violence. Jon spent most of his time in the chambers that once belonged to Jeor Mormont, wading through reports, reading messages from ravens, meeting with his officers. When he could, he stole moments to walk with Ygritte along the ramparts, sharing quiet conversation. Sometimes, she would tease him, calling him Lord Crow with a sardonic grin, but there was affection beneath it. They never labeled what they were to each other now, but neither did they hide it. If someone saw them talking intimately, so be it. The Night's Watch typically forbade such attachments, but the world was changing, and many traditions had already been stretched thin. Winter's chill deepened, and the first true snows fell. Scouts reported strange sightings beyond the wall. Walking corpses, ghostly figures in the trees. Some nights, the wind carried howls that made every living soul shudder. But the free folk had fortified several villages near the wall, working with some of the Black Brothers who volunteered to help. They set watchfires, posted sentries. For the first time in living memory, crows and free folk stood guard side by side, straining their eyes into the darkness to catch a glimpse of the dead before it was too late. Then came a day when the horn sounded thrice, an ancient signal that had not been heard in centuries. The long night was coming, the watchers cried, and something stirred in the far north. Panic rippled through the camps. Jon called a council of war, summoning Stannis, Mance Rayder, Tormund Giantsbane, and every leader who could wield influence. Ygritte stood among them, her fiery hair loose around her shoulders, her bow slung over her back. She looked both determined and afraid. Jon addressed the gathered crowd. "We have had reports of White Walkers massing beyond the haunted forest. The dead are on the move. We must be prepared." He glanced at Stannis. "The time to march against the Boltons may have come. We cannot allow them to hold Winterfell if we need the entire North united. But we must leave enough strength to hold the wall." Stannis nodded. "I have some 3,000 men, plus the free folk who have chosen to join. If we strike quickly, we might seize Winterfell before the worst of the snows block the roads." Mance Rayder, arms crossed, said, "Tormund will lead a force alongside yours, if you treat them fairly and don't force them into the vanguard as fodder." Tormund grunted in agreement, tapping his axe on the floor. Ygritte cleared her throat. "We fight together or we all die. There's no point in half measures." A consensus was reached. Stannis would march south with part of his force, along with free folk volunteers, to wrest Winterfell from the Boltons. Jon would remain at the wall with most of the Night's Watch to maintain the defenses. Mance would stay at Castle Black, under guard but allowed to consult with the free folk as needed. It was an odd arrangement, filled with mistrust, but necessity bound them together. On the eve of the departure, Ygritte found Jon in his solar, where he sat writing letters to send by Raven to the remaining loyalists in the north. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him silently for a moment, then stepped forward. "I have to go," she said simply. Jon looked up, brow furrowed. "Go? You're still recovering from that wound." "You don't have to." She shook her head. "Tormund and the others will need me to speak for the free folk. I can't sit idle while they march on Winterfell. And if you're staying behind to hold the wall, someone else has to keep the free folk from turning on Stannis the moment they see a chance. They trust me, Jon." He exhaled slowly. "I know, but I worry for you." A ghost of a smile passed across her lips. "You always worry. I'm a spearwife, Jon Snow. I've faced worse than some kneeler knights." She paused, stepping closer. "When this is done, one way or another, I'll come back." Jon pushed his chair back and stood, taking her hands in his. "I wish I could go with you," he admitted. "But the Watch needs me here." She nodded, letting her forehead rest against his chest for a moment. "Aye, they do. You're Lord Commander now. We've both got a duty, you and I." He didn't speak. Instead, he bent his head, kissing her gently. Her lips were warm, a slight taste of salt from unshed tears. For a moment, they were only two people in a room, sharing a fragile spark of affection in a world on the brink of darkness. He felt her hand clutch his cloak, as if she feared he might disappear. Then they pulled apart, breathless. "Keep them alive," Jon said quietly. "Keep them from tearing each other apart." "I will," she promised. "Just don't let the dead climb the wall before we get back." He gave a shaky laugh. "I'll do my best." Before dawn the next day, the host assembled in Castle Black's courtyard. Stannis sat astride a warhorse, his armor glinting dully in the weak light. Knights and sellswords formed ranks, muttering curses about the cold. Among them were clusters of free folk warriors, spearwives, raiders, even a few giants who had begrudgingly agreed to ally for the sake of the coming war. Tormund Giantsbane bellowed jokes to keep his men's spirits up, though his breath plumed white in the icy air. Ygritte wore furs, her bow slung across her back, her expression set. She mounted a shaggy northern horse, unaccustomed to riding but determined to keep up. She spotted Jon standing on the steps of the common hall, flanked by his black brothers. They shared a brief look from across the yard, wordless and intense. Then the gates opened, groaning in protest. With a blast of horns, the army marched out, heading south through the muddy tracks that led to the King's Road. Snow fell in flurries, stinging their faces. Jon watched until they disappeared into the swirling white, his heart tight in his chest. So much was at stake. Winterfell, the North's allegiance, the free folks' future. And beyond it all, the shadow of the White Walkers loomed. Days passed in a relentless routine at the wall. Jon oversaw the distribution of supplies, the the fortification of the gates, the posting of sentries. Ravens came bearing news of skirmishes on the road south, where Stannis's host encountered roving Bolton patrols. Another raven arrived from Samwell Tarly in the Citadel, though it offered little more than academic musings on dragonglass and old tales of the long night. Winter bit deeper, turning the nights so cold that the ramparts were sheathed in ice. Yet Jon refused to leave them unguarded. Men walked the heights at all hours, scanning the north with wary eyes. Every gust of wind seemed to carry a distant shriek that might be a trick of the mind, or might be something worse. When the first wave of whites appeared in the darkness, the brothers sounded the horns. Dozens of dead men, their eyes blazing with unnatural blue light, stumbled out of the shadows, clawing at the wall's foothills. Jon led a sortie beyond the gates, armed with torches and dragonglass daggers. The battle was brutal but swift. The free folk settlement nearby sent warriors as well, and together they destroyed the shambling corpses, burning the remains. In the flickering orange glow, Jon stood panting, surrounded by the charred bones of the dead, and knew this was only the beginning. 3 more raids followed in quick succession, each one testing the defenses. The watchfires were kept blazing, and the men grew haggard with fear and lack of sleep. Mance Rayder, under guard, offered what tactical advice he could, pointing out that small groups of whites might be probing for weaknesses before a larger assault. "They don't need rest," he reminded Jon grimly. "They'll keep coming." Jon wrote frantic letters to Stannis, urging a swift victory in the south so he could return with any reinforcements. Ravens flew out each dawn, but the replies never came. The bitter weather likely slowed messages. Each passing day with no word from Ygritte weighed on Jon's mind like a millstone. He pictured her riding through blizzards, clashing with Bolton men on the field, her side still aching from that arrow wound. He prayed silently that she survived, that she was safe. Maester Aemon's health declined as the cold deepened. He was old, frail, and the bitter chill seeped into his bones. Still, he gave what counsel he could, lying in his bed, shaking with fever. He spoke of Targaryen histories, of the need for unity, of the danger that awaited them all. Jon visited him often, kneeling by his bedside, listening to the old man's final words of wisdom. It felt as though the old bear's legacy now lived in Jon, a mantle he had not asked for but must bear. Then, at last, a raven arrived from somewhere in the north. The letter it carried was hastily scrawled, flecked with blood. Jon's heart pounded as he read it. The gist was this: Stannis had reached the outskirts of Winterfell. They had fought Bolton outriders. The snowdrifts were hip-deep in places, and the cold was killing horses and men alike. They had clashed in a series of small battles with no clear victor. The free folk led by Tormund and Ygritte fought bravely, but the Bolton forces were entrenched behind Winterfell's walls. Several northern lords had rallied to Stannis, but others remained neutral or hostile. Winter threatened to trap them all in a frozen siege. Jon's eyes lingered on the mention of Ygritte. She lived. She had been seen fighting with her bow, felling knights with deadly accuracy. But the letter also spoke of heavy losses and treacherous conditions. If Stannis could not break the Boltons soon, the entire campaign might fail. Or worse, they might all starve before the White Walkers even arrived. He paced his solar, the letter in hand, debating whether to try sending men south. But the watch was already spread thin, battling whites and fortifying their position. Mance Rayder cautioned him against it. "You'll only weaken the wall," he warned. "The free folk you have here are not enough to hold if the army of the dead comes in force. You need every sword." Jon despised the thought of doing nothing while Ygritte and Tormund faced the Boltons. But he could not abandon the wall. He thought bitterly of how the old oath chained him in place. Honor set him at odds with love. In the end, he steeled himself and remained, ensuring that Castle Black stood as a beacon of survival in the encroaching darkness. Weeks passed in grinding monotony. Patrols, skirmishes with small bands of the dead, endless vigilance. The watch's supplies began to dwindle, and the free folk settlements scrambled to preserve what they could from the meager harvest. Word came that Eastwatch by the sea had also faced attacks of whites coming from the frozen shore. The entire wall was under siege by the undead, as if some malevolent power tested each segment for cracks. Through it all, Jon carried the memory of Ygritte with him like a torch in the night. Her fierce smile, her biting wit, the warmth of her hand in his. He recalled how she had teased him for being ignorant of the free folk's ways, how she had taught him that freedom was worth more than any crown. He prayed the seven, the old gods, any gods that might listen, that she would return. One dawn, as the gray light touched the icy ramparts, a single rider approached from the south. The man was frostbitten, sagging in the saddle. The gate swung open to admit him, and Jon rushed to meet the newcomer. The rider collapsed, half frozen, into Jon's arms. "They've taken Winterfell," he croaked, voice hoarse. "The Bolton boy, Ramsay, he's dead. Stannis. He sits in Winterfell now, but the cost. The cost." Jon's eyes widened. "And the free folk? Tormund, Ygritte, the man, a northern levy from Bear Island," nodded faintly. "They fought like demons. Tormund lived. The spear wife with the red hair. She's alive last I saw. She was wounded, but she refused to leave the fight." Relief and fear warred in Jon's chest. What else? How many survived? The messenger coughed violently. "Not enough," he managed. "Stannis calls for help. The snows, they're burying us. We have wounded, we lack provisions. Bolton loyalists are harrying the roads. If reinforcements don't come soon, we'll lose Winterfell to the winter itself." Jon hurried to summon the watch officers. He shared the grim tidings. Winterfell was in Stannis's hands, for the moment. The North might rally behind him, or might simply wait for him to freeze and starve. If Stannis fell, the realm lost a major chance at unity, and the free folk who had marched south would be stranded in enemy territory. Mance Rayder came as well, guarded. "If we do nothing," he said, "those who followed Tormund and Ygritte will be lost. That might break the alliance we have here." Jon raked a hand through his dark hair. "We can't abandon the wall. The dead don't stop." He rubbed his temples, a headache pounding. "But maybe we can spare a relief column of free folk and some black brothers who volunteer. Enough to bring supplies or at least help secure the road. We can't let Winterfell become a grave. We need it if we're to rally the North for the war against the Walkers." Ser Dennis Mallister frowned. "Lord Commander, we barely have enough men to hold Castle Black." Jon shook his head. "I'll ask for volunteers only, and we'll gather what supplies we can spare. The free folk won't want their kin left to die in the snow. Tormund and Ygritte are leaders they respect. They'll go. We must strike quickly, or winter will swallow them all." Within 2 days, a ragtag convoy of sleds and horses prepared to leave for Winterfell. About 100 black brothers offered to go, mostly newer recruits who believed in Jon's cause or had no family to miss them. 300 free folk joined, men and women both, anxious to rescue their own and scavenge what they could from the rich lands around Winterfell. They packed casks of grain, salted meat, and medicinal herbs. Jon wanted to lead them himself. Every fiber of his being urged him to go to Ygritte. But duty chained him. He was Lord Commander responsible for the wall. He hovered by the gates, dressed in black furs, watching as the convoy assembled. The wind blew snow in stinging gusts. The free folk had improvised banners, scraps of fur tied to spears, symbols of clan or personal bravery. A handful of black brothers wore the Night's Watch colors. It was an odd sight. Crows and free folk united for a common purpose. Mance Rayder approached Jon, guards bracketing him warily. "I should go," he said quietly. "They'll fight harder if I'm with them. They'll know the king beyond the wall still stands for them." Jon hesitated. "Stannis put you under guard. He won't be pleased if you leave." Mance scoffed. "Stannis is stuck in Winterfell. He can't do much about it now." He caught Jon's eye. "We both know this alliance is fragile. I can't mend it from a cell." After a tense moment, Jon nodded. "Very well. Go. Help them reach Winterfell before it's too late. Show them we can stand together." He signaled the guards to allow Mance to join the convoy. Mance's face flickered with something like respect. Then he mounted a horse and took his place at the head of the column. With a shout, they started forward into the drifting snow. Jon stood by the gate until the last of them vanished into the white haze. Ghost, his direwolf, stood at his side, silent and watchful, red eyes glowing. Jon reached down, ruffling the wolf's thick fur. "I should have gone," he murmured to no one in particular, but the winds carried his words away, leaving only the whisper of winter. The days that followed were a test of patience. The skirmishes with whites continued, but no major assault came. Some men grumbled that the dead must be massing for a final blow. Supplies at Castle Black ran lower. Morale wavered. Jon did all he could to keep spirits from collapsing, reminding everyone of the relief force heading to Winterfell, the alliance with Stannis, the farmland they might claim in the gift come spring, if spring ever arrived. Finally, another raven arrived. The parchment was signed in an almost neat hand. Ygritte's. She wasn't practiced in writing, but someone must have helped her. The note was brief but life-changing. "Jon, we made it to Winterfell. Stannis still holds it, battered but unbroken. We brought food and men. I'm alive, wounded again. Damn it, but I'll survive. Tormund sends his regards. Says you owe him a horn of ale. Mance is here, stirring hope. The North is stirring, too. Some lords have bent to Stannis, others are waiting. The snows are relentless, but we have shelter. I think of you often. Wish you were here, but I know where your duty lies. I'll make sure these fools don't kill each other before the real war begins. We'll come north soon, with the whole North behind us, or so Stannis promises. Hold the wall. Keep yourself alive. I'm counting on you, Jon Snow." "Why?" Jon read it twice, his heart thrumming. Relief coursed through him like a warm draft in a freezing storm. She lived, she was fighting, and she remembered him. After all that had happened, they were still bound together by the same purpose. He clutched the note, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Ghost pressed close to his side, as if sensing his moment of solace. Stepping outside the rookery, Jon lifted his eyes to the great wall towering above them, ice shimmering in the pale winter light. He thought of what lay ahead. The dead, winter, the uncertain loyalty of northern lords, the fragile trust of the free folk, the relentless demands of being Lord Commander. And yet, for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. Ygritte lived. They had forged the beginning of an alliance between the free folk and the North, one that might stand a chance against the long night. And if they succeeded, if the North truly rose under Stannis's banner, then maybe, just maybe, all their sacrifices would not be in vain. So he tucked the note safely into his cloak, turned his face to the biting wind, and strode off to see to the 1,000 tasks that awaited him. Because that was the promise he'd made, to fight for the living. And Ygritte, far away in Winterfell's snowy courtyards, would be doing the same. Their bond was sealed by shared hardship and a vision of a world saved from the darkness. Neither of them would rest until that vision became reality, or until the North itself fell into eternal night. And as the sun set behind the towering wall, its last rays setting the ice aglow, Jon Snow stood firm, the new Lord Commander with the memory of a fierce, red-haired spearwife burning in his heart, and a kingdom's fate balanced on the edge of a blade. Jon Snow read Ygritte's letter again and again, letting the curve of each clumsily formed letter sink into his mind. Though her handwriting was uneven, likely guided by someone's steadier hand, the words bore all the fierce determination he had come to know in her. She was in Winterfell, alive but wounded, yet unbroken. She was with Tormund Giantsbane and Stannis Baratheon, who now held the castle by a thread, surrounded by deepening snowdrifts and the uncertain loyalty of northern lords. They could not withstand both hunger and the punishing cold for long. Winter was closing its fist around them. He tucked the letter inside his cloak, pressing it against his heart as though it might bring him some ghost of her warmth. For a long moment, Jon stood near the base of the wall, gazing up at the thick ramparts, the ice glowing faintly in the dull daylight. The wind howled, blowing snow across his cheeks. A swirl of conflicting emotions threatened to overwhelm him. Relief that she lived, worry that she was in danger, guilt that he could not ride to her side. He was Lord Commander now. The Black Brothers looked to him for leadership. The free folk who had remained near the wall trusted him to keep them safe. Another letter had arrived that morning, far more ominous. A scouting party heading east had found a settlement wiped out, with no signs of life other than corpses that bore the unmistakable chill of white corruption. The White Walkers were no longer content to send small probing forces. They were wiping entire camps from the map. Jon had posted every available man along the wall. He had no illusions. If the others came in full force before Stannis returned, Castle Black and the other forts would struggle to hold. Perhaps they would fall. That knowledge pressed on him every waking moment, a cruel weight that would not lessen. He turned from the wall and headed inside, Ghost padding silently at his side. The corridors were cold, lit by sputtering torches that did little to chase away the gloom. He could hear men sparring in the training yard, their curses mingling with the clang of steel on steel. Others warmed themselves in the common hall, rationing thin bowls of stew. Food was tight, as it had always been, but winter threatened to make matters worse. Pushing open the door to the Lord Commander's solar, once Jeor Mormont's, Jon was greeted by the scent of smoky firewood and old parchment. A small hearth crackled in the corner, though the heat from it never truly warmed the stone walls. Maester Aemon's empty chair reminded Jon of the old man's passing only days before. Aemon had taken ill with fever, shivering and delirious. His final words had been a plea for unity, for protecting the realm from the cold darkness rising in the far north. Even as he drifted in and out of consciousness, he had whispered, "Targaryen, the blood of the dragon," before losing himself again. His death felt like one more light snuffed out in a gathering night. Inside the solar, Jon found a cluster of people waiting. Ser Dennis Mallister, First Builder Yarwick, and a few older Black brothers who formed his unofficial council. Ed Tollett, known to all as Dolorous Ed, leaned against the wall, looking more morose than usual. Among them stood a small group of free folk leaders who had remained after Mance Rayder and the bulk of the rescue convoy rode south. One was a tall spearwife with sinewy arms and crow's feather braids, named Morna. Another was an older man with a ragged scar across his cheek, called Wool after his clan's name. They looked uneasy, standing within these thick stone walls that once would have been barred to them. "Lord Commander," Ser Dennis said with a respectful dip of his head. "We've news from Eastwatch. Their scouts sighted more whites near the coastline. It seems small pockets are testing our defenses. Might be time to send more men." Jon nodded, releasing a soft sigh. "We don't have many to spare, but Eastwatch must hold. If the White Walkers break through there, they can swarm the coast and come around the wall's far flank. There's no natural barrier on the sea when it ices over. We'll send what we can." "And us?" asked Morna, her voice carrying the distinct rhythms of a free folk accent. "We're not caged birds to be kept behind your walls. Some of ours can go, too." Jon regarded her thoughtfully. "Would your people volunteer for such a mission?" Morna shrugged. "We'd rather fight than sit idle. If we do nothing, the dead will come for us soon enough. Better to meet them on our own terms." Italit cleared his throat. "Seems meeting the dead on any terms is a good way to end up among them." Morna shot him a dark look, but Jon intervened. "I welcome the help, truly. We'll equip you with torches, dragonglass arrowheads, anything we have to slow the whites. But you must follow the commands of Eastwatch's acting commander, Cotter Pike. He'll decide how best to deploy you." She nodded, though she did not look pleased about taking orders from a Black brother. "Better than sitting here waiting to freeze." Ser Dennis Mallister ran a hand over his bald pate. "You must know, my lord, that our supplies are dangerously low. Sending even a few more men across the north will strain what resources we have." "I know," Jon said quietly, "but if we don't guard Eastwatch, we might as well open the gates and let the others march right through. We'll muster a small company, volunteers only." A hush fell in the room, broken only by the distant wail of wind through cracks in the fortress walls. John's mind drifted to Ygritte, to Tormund, to the countless free folk and black brothers who had gone south. They, too, needed supplies, needed relief from the crushing cold. But if the White Walkers were truly mobilizing, the greatest danger still lay at the top of the world. At last he cleared his throat. "We'll make do. The men will be rationed again, at least until we learn whether Winterfell can send relief. Ser Dennis, see about any old storerooms we haven't yet inventoried. Builder Yarwick, double-check the fort's outer walls. Patch any cracks. A few more nights of this cold and we may find ourselves with a new breach. I'll handle the ravens to Eastwatch." They all bowed or nodded, drifting away to their tasks. Morna and Wool exchanged a look, then followed Dennis out, presumably to prepare their own free folk band for the journey east. Dolorous Ed lingered, arms folded. "I'll go if you like, Lord Commander." John shook his head, a faint smile touching his lips. "I need you here, Ed. With the state of things, I can't afford to lose your counsel." Ed's eyes were as mournful as ever. "Some counsel. I can tell you how many ways we might die before morning. Would that help?" "It might keep me realistic," John replied, and Ed gave a half-snort of agreement before slouching out of the solar. John was left alone with the crackling fire and his thoughts. He withdrew Ygritte's letter, running his finger along the edges as if the parchment itself could grant him a moment's peace. A part of him wished desperately to ride south, to see her, to stand with her at Winterfell's battlements. Yet he stayed, bound by the vow and by the fragile alliance he had built here at Castle Black. The realm needed the watch intact more than ever. He returned to the table, where maps and scattered reports lay in disarray. He thought of Stannis trying to hold Winterfell in the face of howling snowstorms, Bolton loyalists lurking in the shadows, and the complicated politics of the great northern houses. Without the North's support, Stannis might end up trapped, starved out, or forced to retreat. And if he failed, if he lost that crucial seat of power, the free folk caught within Winterfell's walls would pay the price. John squared his shoulders. One crisis at a time. He would do what he could from this end. Send ravens with pleas for help, scrounge up additional supplies for the relief convoy, maintain the watch against the dead. The next move in this game of survival would be decided as much by the bitter storms as by any cunning or valor. At Winterfell, Ygritte found the courtyard thick with half-frozen mud. The walls caked in ice so that their surface seemed to glisten in the pale sunlight. The castle's repair was slow, undone by each new snowfall. Yet the battered gates still stood, the ramparts still patrolled by men wearing the flaming heart of the Lord of Light or the odd symbol of a free folk clan. It was a sight she never would have believed possible only months ago. Raiders and kneelers side by side, trying to hold a castle that once belonged to the Stark line. From her vantage near the Great Keep, she surveyed the yard. She spotted Tormund Giantsbane giving orders to a group of free folk spearwives, among them a tall woman with a raven tattoo on her neck. He was holding up a massive warhammer, likely loot from a fallen knight, demonstrating how to break an armored foe's skull with an overhead swing. Ygritte rolled her eyes fondly. Tormund might not be subtle, but no one could doubt his spirit. Her side still ached where she had taken a pike thrust during the siege. It was the second major wound she had survived in so short a time, and she knew John would be furious if he saw how she winced every time she twisted her torso. But she refused to lie abed. The nights were too cold, the day too full of tasks. Where she could help, she would. "Ygritte!" Tormund roared in greeting as she approached. He clapped her on the back, nearly knocking the breath from her lungs. "Gathered some new recruits here. More o' our folk trickling in by the day. Bastards and broken men, too, from the north. Seems they'd rather trust our company than that of the Bolton Flayers." "Flayers?" Ygritte murmured, trying to suppress a shudder. She had heard the stories of House Bolton's cruelty. "Good. We need all the help we can muster, if we're to stay in this place." Tormund cast a scornful look around. "Not much of a place, if you ask me. The snow's piled high in every corner. Half the roofs are caved in, and we're lacking stores. Even the rats are half dead from cold." A deep voice spoke from behind them. "We hold it nonetheless," came the measured, stern tone of King Stannis Baratheon. He was dressed in furs over his black armor, the red heart of R'hllor emblazoned on his breast. His face was gaunt, shadowed by the strain of the campaign and the relentless winter. "We took Winterfell from a traitorous bastard and his father, and we shall not yield it now." Tormund just grunted, though he did not contradict the king. Ygritte inclined her head a fraction. She might never kneel to a man, but she had seen enough to respect the iron determination Stannis possessed. "We need supplies, your grace," she said frankly. "We have more mouths than we have bread, and the storms have locked up the roads." Stannis's gaze flicked to a roped-off section of the courtyard, where newly dug trenches served as mass graves for those who had died in the siege or from the bitter cold afterward. "The men will starve if we do not open the roads soon. I have asked the lords Manderly and Serwyn for assistance, but they only send scraps. Until we prove beyond all doubt that I am the rightful king, the northern lords will hoard their stores for themselves. Foolishness, given the threat that marches from beyond the wall." He turned back to Ygritte. "I have heard rumors that reinforcements from Castle Black may be on their way, a relief force bringing what they can spare. Not many, but enough to help us stand through the worst of winter." Ygritte nodded. Mance Rayder rode out to meet them. Word was sent ahead. "He'll bring them here, if the snows don't swallow them first." In truth, she worried for Mance. He was a capable man, but he carried himself with a certain fatalism these days. She suspected that being confined by Stannis's command had weighed heavily on his pride, even after he was allowed to move freely in the siege. Still, there was no better man to rally free folk scattered in the hinterlands. Stannis's lips pressed tight. "I will see to it that the roads leading north from Winterfell are scouted, cleared if possible. We mustn't lose the chance to link forces with the Watch." Tormund eyed the king skeptically. "You can't just wave your sword and melt the snow. These storms are fierce. Our folk know how to get around, but half the riders from the south are losing themselves in drifts and freezing to death." Ygritte watched Stannis's face grow darker. A lesser man might have barked at Tormund's insolence, but Stannis only frowned deeper, accepting that the problem could not be solved by will alone. "We do what we must," he said. "If we cannot keep Winterfell supplied, we will freeze in these walls, or be forced to sally out and scatter, which would cost us the hold we fought so hard to gain. The Bolton's men remain in the countryside, plotting. The moment they see weakness, they will strike." He stiffened as he noticed Melisandre approaching, a red blur in the swirling snow. The priestess moved with eerie grace, her crimson robes swirling behind her. When she reached them, she offered Stannis a slight bow of the head. "Your grace, the Lord of Light sends us a sign. In the flames, I saw a road of bones leading from the north to Winterfell." Tormund snorted. "Road of bones, is it? That sounds cheery." Melisandre's red eyes danced over Ygritte and Tormund. "It is not a symbol of defeat, but a warning that the journey will be perilous. Yet if we remain steadfast, the king's cause will triumph. R'hllor's fire cannot be extinguished by mortal cold." Ygritte had no patience for the cryptic remarks of the Red Woman. She had seen men burned by her at Dragonstone, or so the rumors went. Melisandre wanted to burn Mance Rayder as well, until Stannis had been persuaded otherwise. The memory still boiled Ygritte's blood, yet she held her tongue. Stannis needed Melisandre's counsel, or so he believed. "Then we prepare, Red Woman," Tormund said with a hint of challenge in his tone. "We're used to roads of bones north of the wall." Melisandre allowed a ghost of a smile. "Indeed, the free folk have long walked with death at their heels. Now the rest of Westeros must learn to do the same." Stannis signaled the end of the exchange with a curt nod. "I will gather a scouting party at once. Ygritte, you should remain in the castle. Your wound is not fully healed." Ygritte squared her shoulders. "I'm able enough. Let me ride with them. I know these folk. Some of them are my clan. They'll trust me more than they trust your knights. That alone can save time and lives on the road." Stannis weighed her words. "As you wish, but see that you do not overreach. If you cannot keep pace, we will not slow for you." She lifted her chin, a defiant spark in her green eyes. "I'll keep pace, your grace." 2 days later, Ygritte rode out from Winterfell at the head of a mixed band. 24 free folk, half as many knights of Stannis, and a handful of local guides who had once served House Stark or House Glover. It was the best they could muster, given how many men lay injured or frostbitten within the castle walls. Their mission was to push northward along the main track, searching for signs of Mance Raiders' convoy, clearing obstacles if possible, and marking a safe route for any who followed. The cold was worse than Ygritte remembered from her earliest years beyond the wall. Each breath burned her lungs, and the wind threatened to freeze the tears from her eyes. She wrapped herself in thick furs, her horse's muzzle covered by a scrap of hide to protect it from the biting chill. Yet for all the discomfort, she felt strangely alive. This was a purpose she understood. No tangled politics, no waiting around for some king's command. Just the open road and the drive to survive. Tormund had wanted to come as well, but Stannis insisted on keeping him near Winterfell's gate to maintain order among the free folk stationed inside. Ygritte hadn't argued. She knew Tormund's big presence was a rallying force in the castle, and that she was better suited for scouting than he. Still, riding out without his booming laughter felt odd. Instead, a smaller free folk warrior named Jaren fell in beside her, as well as a spearwife called Orsa, who had a face set in permanent disapproval. The knights were led by Ser Brendel, a man with a short brown beard and deep lines around his eyes. He had followed Stannis from Dragonstone, it was said, and worshipped Lawler fervently, though he had none of Melisandre's flair for prophecy. Jaren had muttered that he didn't trust the man. Ygritte told him simply to keep his sword close and watchful. They rode north for 3 days. The going was agonizingly slow, wading through drifts that reached the horses' chests. Oftentimes, they had to dismount and hack at ice with hatchets, or push the beasts with ropes. Each time they crested a rise, Ygritte scanned the horizon. The vast white of winter laid itself out before them, broken only by dead stands of trees and the ragged silhouettes of abandoned farms. Ravens wheeled overhead, cawing hungrily. On the second night, they made camp in a dilapidated stable, half the roof torn away by some earlier storm. The free folk refused to sleep in the same building as the knights, so they established 2 fires, glowering at each other across a short expanse. Ygritte could feel the tension in the air, but she let it be. She was too tired and cold to mediate. Instead, she huddled close to Jaren and Orsa, the 3 of them sharing some watered-down wine that a knight had begrudgingly offered. "We should have stayed behind, let Mance come on his own," Orsa grumbled. She wore a thick hood pulled low over her face. "We're risking our lives out here, and I don't see the sense in it." "There's sense in it," Ygritte countered. "If we find Mance and the others, we guide them safely to Winterfell. Then we have a better chance of surviving. Winter's only going to get worse. If they're stranded on the road, they die. That does no one any good." Jaren blew into his hands. "And if they're already dead? What if the storms took them, or the whites?" Silence fell. Ygritte closed her eyes, recalling memories of Mance's voice, his wry smile. She refused to believe he had perished so easily. He had led them through the Frostfangs, survived the wrath of the White Walkers more than once. "He's still alive," she said stubbornly. "He'll make it. We just need to make sure we find him in time." Neither Jaren nor Orsa argued. Around them, the wind howled through the broken timbers, and the night's fire sputtered. Ygritte pulled her cloak tighter, ignoring the twinge in her side. By the following afternoon, the weather turned even colder. The wind was no longer content to blow steadily. It gusted in vicious bursts that threatened to knock riders from the saddle. Ygritte shouted for the group to stay close together. Ser Brendel, swathed in furs, called to his knights to keep the pace. Their breath came in ragged puffs, eyelashes crusted with ice. The horses whinnied and rolled their eyes, near panic from the constant blasts of chill air. At midday, they came upon a small ravine cut through a low ridge, where the snow had drifted dangerously high. The lead riders peered into the narrow passage, uncertain if they could pass without risk of an avalanche. Ygritte urged her horse forward. She dismounted to climb a mound of snow on foot, trying to see the shape of the land. A gust of wind stung her eyes, and she lifted a gloved hand to shield them. "Careful, spear wife," Ser Brendel called from below. "That drift might collapse under you." She gritted her teeth, ignoring him. Bit by bit, she ascended until she reached the top, peering beyond the ravine. The land beyond was bleak, but she could make out the faint track of a road. Snow had blanketed it, but she saw the hint of something. Footprints, hooves, or wagon wheels. Hard to tell from this distance, but it gave her a surge of hope. "I see a route," she shouted back, the wind snatching at her voice. "We can make it if we're careful." Then she noticed something else. A dark shape near the foot of the ravine, half buried in snow. She slid down, beckoning Jaren to follow. Digging away at the frozen drift, they uncovered a wooden wagon, toppled onto its side. The wood was as splintered as though from an attack or from sheer mishap in the storm. Ygritte pulled aside one cracked board to peer within. Barrels, broken crates, sacks of grain gone to ruin in the cold. Her heart sank. This might have been part of Mance's convoy, or it could have belonged to a merchant or a band of refugees. Hard to say. Jaren stooped beside her. "Tracks lead away," he said, pointing to an area where the drift was disturbed. Maybe they continued on foot. Ser Brendel approached, flanked by 2 knights. "We can salvage little here. The grain is soaked through and frozen, but perhaps whoever lost this wagon survived." "We follow," Ygritte decided, slinging her bow over her shoulder. "Check every hollow, every snow drift. If they're still out here, they'll be near the road." It took the better part of the day to ease their horses through the ravine. More than once, they had to lead the animals by hand, coaxing them through narrow bends. The wind seemed to concentrate in that channel, screaming in their ears. Snow blinded them until they could hardly see the rider in front of them. At last, they emerged onto a stretch of flatter land. The track was clearer here, shielded from drifting by a line of stunted pine trees. But the sun was sinking, the sky turning an ominous shade of gray. Ser Brendel called a halt, urging caution. "We can't keep going in the dark. We'll lose the trail." Ygritte wanted to keep moving, but her exhausted limbs and the shivering horses argued otherwise. They set camp in the lee of a pine wood, building a modest fire from dead branches and scraps of brush. The free folk huddled together, the knights forming a loose ring around them. Even after days of travel, a gulf remained between the 2 groups. Ygritte slumped onto a rock, massaging her aching ribs. The wound had scabbed over, but cold made every scar throb. Orsa sat next to her, handing her a small flask of something strong and biting, moonshine or its free folk equivalent. Ygritte took a swig, feeling the sharp burn ripple through her chest. "Tomorrow we keep looking," she said quietly. "We'll find them," Orsa nodded. "And if we don't, we'll be lucky to make it back to Winterfell alive." Before Ygritte could answer, one of the knights shouted, "Rider! Rider approaching!" The entire camp tensed. Ygritte snatched up her bow and knocked an arrow, ignoring the stab of pain in her side. The free folk grabbed spears. The knights drew swords. In the dim twilight, they could make out a single horse, moving slowly, weaving unsteadily between the snowdrifts. A figure slumped in the saddle. "It might be one of ours," Ser Brendel said, raising a hand to caution. "Hold until we see them clearly." The figure drew closer, and Ygritte could see the horse's heaving sides, the rider's cloak tattered. At last, the horse staggered into the ring of firelight. The rider nearly toppled. Ygritte darted forward, catching them before they fell. A woman, young, pale, with lips cracked from cold. She had a crude brand of a horned skull on her forearm, a common free folk mark. "Help me?" the woman croaked, eyes rolling back. "They're all dead." Ygritte and Orsa eased her to the ground near the fire. Ser Brendel signaled for the camp's small supply of wine to be brought over. The woman shuddered, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. Beneath the cloak, Ygritte saw a nasty cut on the woman's thigh, encrusted with blood and ice. "What happened?" Ygritte asked gently, holding the flask to the woman's lips. "Who attacked you?" The woman drank greedily, gagging slightly on the strong taste. She tried to focus her eyes, desperation etched in every line of her face. "Whites," she rasped. "They came from the trees, from the ground. We were part of a larger group. Mance Raiders men. We had wagons of grain. They surrounded us, cut us off. We fought, but, oh gods, they took them all. I ran." Murmurs of alarm rippled through the circle. Ygritte felt her stomach drop. "Mance? Did you see him?" The woman shook her head, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Not him specifically. It was chaos. Some of us scattered. Others fell. The wagon." She coughed violently. I thought we'd all freeze or be slaughtered. Our torches kept some of the whites back, but there were too many." Ygritte glanced up at Ser Brendel, whose expression had hardened. He murmured to his knights, "We're too small a force to fight off a large group of whites. If they truly roam these woods in number, we must be wary." Ygritte clenched her jaw. "We have to find survivors. Mance or any free folk. They might still be alive, holed up somewhere. And if they're not?" Orsa asked, her voice trembling. She tried to mask it with a snarl. "We charge into the jaws of death for nothing?" Ygritte's mind flicked to Jon at the wall, remembering how he had told her that for unity to mean anything, they must save one another. Could she turn back now? "We came this far. We can't just leave them to freeze. Or worse, we press on at first light." Ser Brendel gave her a level look. "We can scout, yes, but if we meet a horde of whites, we must retreat. Our duty is to return with word to the king, not to die in a hopeless fight." Ygritte nodded grudgingly. She knew these knights owed little loyalty to Mance or the free folk. She would have to rely on her own if it came to a final stand. "Understood. We'll see what the morning brings." They tended to the wounded woman, cleaning her leg wound as best they could and wrapping it in cloth. She drifted into a fitful sleep. Ygritte kept watch throughout the night, dozing only in short, uneasy increments. Each time the fire crackled, she flinched, half expecting a shambling corpse to emerge from the swirling snow. Her nightmares were filled with glimpses of the dead, empty eyes glowing an unnatural blue, reaching out with frozen hands to drag the living into their ranks. By dawn, the weather had changed again. Light snow continued to fall, but the wind had eased, leaving an eerie hush over the landscape. The group set out warily, the wounded woman lashed to a horse behind one of the knights. Every shadow beneath a tree seemed poised to come alive with whites. They found the site of the attack by mid-morning. Overturned wagons, scattered crates, half-burned torches lying in the snow. Bodies, some of them hacked to pieces in the free folk style of ensuring the dead did not rise again. But others looked disturbingly intact, albeit frozen stiff. Ygritte forced herself to approach one, an older man with frosty stubble on his chin. His eyes were open, clouded with a faint blue sheen. Her gut twisted. "Light them," Ser Brendel said, grim-faced. "We'll not risk them waking." Knights and free folk moved among the dead, piling them into a crude pyre. Ygritte joined in the grim task, hardly feeling the cold as she hauled limbs stiff as boards. No sign of Mance Raider's body, though, which offered a faint spark of hope. They set fire to the pile with difficulty, using what little oil they had. The flames sputtered, sending a greasy black plume into the sky. Ygritte picked through the remains of the wagons. Little was salvageable. Any grain or provisions had been scattered or ruined. She found dragonglass arrowheads, cracked from the cold. Tucked beneath an overturned crate, she found a cloak that looked familiar. A brown, homespun cloak Mance sometimes wore. Her heart jumped in her chest. No sign of blood, though, which might mean he discarded it or lost it in the chaos. At least it wasn't lying on a corpse. At the far edge of the camp, Jaren shouted, "Tracks!" Everyone rushed over. Through the flattening snow, footprints led away, heading farther north. The prints were jumbled, suggesting a group of perhaps a dozen. Some deeper than others, likely from wounded or those carrying supplies. They continued in a wavering line, disappearing over a small ridge. "We follow," Ygritte said firmly, not waiting for Ser Brendel's approval. "This is all we have to go on." The knights did not protest. Their own sense of duty compelled them to see this through, though none looked happy about it. They pressed on, scanning the tree-line for the watchful dead. Ygritte felt her pulse pound in her ears, waiting for the next ambush. Hours passed in tense silence. The tracks kept going, though the snow threatened to bury them. Sometimes they had to guess at the path, circling around to pick it up again. Once they found a bloodstain in the snow, a piece of cloth that looked like it had been ripped from a free folk's tunic. Another time, they found a crude spear left half buried in a drift. The tip snapped off. Each clue drove them onward despite the weariness pulling at their limbs. Near midday, Orsa, who had forged ahead, hurried back with alarm on her face. "There's a ravine up ahead. Looks deep. I saw smoke. Could be from a camp or from White's burning bodies, hard to tell." Ygritte inhaled sharply. "We'll go carefully. Everyone, keep your weapons ready. No mistakes." They moved as one, forging through the thick snow until they reached the lip of the ravine. There, a chasm cut through the land, with steep, icy walls. At the bottom, partially obscured by the ridge, they could see a faint curl of smoke rising from a cluster of stunted trees. Hidden in that hollow, a small group of survivors might have built a fire. But if White surrounded them, it could be a trap. Ser Brendel turned to Ygritte. "I'll leave some knights here to guard the horses. We'll descend on foot." She nodded, adrenaline sharpening her senses. Together, they formed two squads, one mostly knights, the other free folk. Slowly, carefully, they made their way down the treacherous slope, clinging to bushes and exposed rocks for support. The deeper they went, the more the wind faded, leaving an eerie stillness. Closer now, Ygritte could see a flicker of flames behind a screen of dead branches. Her heart pounded. If Whites were near, they would have heard them crunching through the snow. Why was there no shout, no warning? At last, they pushed past a stand of skeletal pine and beheld a small bowl-shaped clearing. A single fire crackled in the lee of a rock outcrop. Around it lay half a dozen motionless forms, wrapped in cloaks and furs. Some looked as though they had crawled together for warmth and simply given up. "No," Ygritte whispered. She advanced slowly, arrow nocked. At first, she saw no movement, no sign of life. Then one of the huddled shapes stirred. A man struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on a broken spear. Even from a distance, Ygritte recognized the lines of his face, the gray streak in his hair. "Mance Raider," she breathed, sprinting forward. He saw her and managed a faint, delirious grin. "Well, if it isn't the woman who cheated death. Thought you might be in Winterfell's hall, Ygritte." She knelt beside him, letting her bow drop. "Found your tracks. Heard about the attack. Are you alive?" he managed. His voice was weak, thready. "Barely. Some of the others, not so lucky." Ygritte scanned the clearing, heart clenching. A few free folk lay there, unmoving, eyes closed in eternal sleep. One, though, a young man with a bandaged arm, lifted his head feebly. Another coughed from the shadows. They were starved, frozen, wounded, but not all gone. "Ser Brendel," Ygritte called over her shoulder. "Bring blankets, water. Quickly." The knights hurried in, and the free folk who followed Ygritte spread out to tend to the survivors. Mance sank to his knees as Ygritte helped him ease down, his breath rattling in his chest. "I tried to lead them around the Whites, but we were pinned against the ravine. We lost the wagons, lost the supplies. The snow, Ygritte, it's relentless." She felt tears sting her eyes, blinking them back before they froze on her lashes. "It's all right. We'll get you to Winterfell. Tormund's there, and the king. There's warmth at least." He gave a bitter chuckle that turned into a cough. "Warmth. Never thought I'd be grateful to hide behind stone walls. But I'll swallow my pride if it means saving these people." Ser Brendel approached, kneeling with a skin of water. He offered it to Mance without hesitation. "We must hurry. The daylight fades." and this ravine is poorly defensible if the whites return. Mance nodded, gulping the water. He grimaced at the taste, likely tinged with whatever the knights carried, but forced himself to drink. Ygritte looked around at the battered survivors. Fewer than a dozen, all told, out of what must have been scores. The rest were either dead or missing. "We can't climb back out in the dark," Orsa said anxiously. "We'll end up breaking our necks, and it's freezing again." "Then we set camp here," Ser Brendel said. "We post watches around the perimeter, gather what fuel we can. At first light, we help them out of the ravine. That's the best we can do." Ygritte exhaled, nodding. Her gaze lingered on Mance, who huddled in a borrowed cloak. He still had that spark in his eye, even close to collapse. "We'll see you safe," she promised him. "You hear me?" He grasped her hand weakly. "I hear you, Les. Jon Snow sent his best." "Did he?" She managed a tight smile. "Jon's at the wall. He'd have come himself if he could. But he's protecting us from a worse fate." Mance's eyes flickered with understanding. He let his head drop back against the rock, taking ragged breaths. Ygritte signaled to one of the free folk to bring more wood for the fire. If they could keep these survivors from freezing overnight, they might just see them safe to Winterfell. And from there, well, at least they'd have walls against the cold. Night fell quickly in the ravine, the sky overhead turning a deep indigo. Shadows stretched, swallowing the clearing in gloom. The group ate what meager rations they had left, salted jerky, bits of hardtack. The knights alternated their guard shifts with the free folk, though both parties seemed wary of each other. Occasional arguments broke out over the best place to post a sentry, or which wood was too green to burn, but Ygritte found herself too exhausted to mediate. She checked on Mance's condition, ensuring he was close enough to the fire. Then she tried to snatch a short rest. She jolted awake sometime later, hearing frantic whispers. A knight stood over her, face pale in the flickering light. "Whites," he said, voice trembling. In an instant, Ygritte was on her feet, bow in hand. She scanned the darkness. Others were rousing, grabbing weapons and torches. She saw movement among the trees, shuffling shapes, hunched figures. Their eyes caught the firelight with an eerie glow. "Form a ring," Ser Brendel roared, drawing his sword. "Torches up." The circle of survivors closed in around the fire, knights and free folk together. Ygritte's heart hammered as she lit the tip of an arrow from the flames. She knocked it, drawing the bowstring back. The whites advanced, stumbling over rocks and roots, some half-naked, their flesh gray and stiff. They came from both sides, more than Ygritte could count in the darkness. The first arrow left her bow with a soft twang. The flame-licked shaft struck a white in the chest, igniting the rotted clothing. The creature collapsed in a flurry of sparks. Next to her, Orsa hurled a spear lit with oily rags. One of the knights swung a torch-laden blade. "Keep them at bay," Ser Brendel shouted. "Do not let them close the distance." But the whites kept coming, heedless of fear or pain. Ygritte loosed arrow after arrow, her arms screaming with the strain. Each time she found a target, the flames would flare, halting one or two. But others replaced them, stepping over the smoking remains of the fallen. From the corner of her eye, she saw Jaren grappling with a white that had lunged in, forcing it back with a rag-wrapped torch, the smell of burning flesh making Ygritte gag. Another white, missing half its face, reached for a knight's arm. The man hacked downward with his sword, severing the arm, but the clawed hand continued to twitch on the ground like some pale spider. "This is madness," Orsa cried out, voice taut with terror. "They're too many." Ygritte gritted her teeth, scanning the perimeter for any way out. The ravine walls loomed behind them, too steep to climb under attack, especially in the darkness. They were cornered. She heard Mance calling out from where he lay, urging the free folk to hold strong. But he sounded too weak to rise. Ser Brendel cut down a white with a grunt, and turned to Ygritte, desperation in his eyes. "We can't hold them here. The living can't withstand these numbers all night." Ygritte loosed another flaming arrow. Her quiver was nearly empty. Then we make a break for higher ground, or we die in this hole. But they risked being picked off the moment they tried to scale the slope. Still, waiting here would doom them for certain. The whites advanced in a ragged half-circle, closing in with each heartbeat. The ring of defenders shrank around the central fire. Horses screamed in terror behind them, some thrashing in their tethers. Ygritte felt the old fear coil in her gut. She had faced whites before, but never so many in such a narrow space. A sudden roar shattered the night. In the darkness at the top of the ravine, torches flared. Many torches, a line of them. Then came the unmistakable war cries of free folk, mingled with the harsh shouts of black brothers. "Charge!" A voice bellowed from above, deep and booming. Torchlight rained down the slope as a new force plunged into the fray. Ygritte recognized the silhouette of Tormund Giantsbane barreling forward, wielding a massive axe that glinted with flame. Beside him came other free folk, and beyond them, black-cloaked men with torches and dragonglass-dipped spears. Ygritte's heart soared in stunned relief. Mance let out a hoarse laugh from where he lay. "Ha! There they are." In the flickering glow of so many flames, the newcomers crashed into the whites from behind, hacking and burning. For a moment, the ravine was awash in chaos. Smoke, sparks, screams from both living and dead. Ygritte watched as the whites turned to face this new assault, giving her own group a reprieve. She seized the opportunity, signaling Ser Brendel. "Now, we join the attack." With a ragged shout, they pressed forward, striking at the undead caught between two fires. Ygritte's muscles burned as she slashed with her dragonglass dagger, each contact sending cracks of blackened ice through the white's body. A knight's flaming sword severed a rotted neck. A free folk woman hammered a white skull to pulp. On the ravine's slope, archers rained arrows onto the horde, each arrow crowned in flame. The whites, relentless as they were, could not match the combined fury of two forces striking from opposite sides. One by one, they went down, smoldering and shattering, until the survivors found themselves standing in a circle of bodies, the snow trampled and stained with gore. The stench of burnt flesh stung every nostril. Into that circle strode Tormund, panting, his beard singed in places. He spied Ygritte and let out a bellowing laugh of joy. "Aha! Never thought you'd see my pretty face again. Did you?" Ygritte, breathless, feeling a trickle of blood on her cheek, let out a relieved grin. "What are you doing here? I thought Stannis needed you at Winterfell." He shrugged, letting his axe rest on the ground. "After a time, we got word of Mance's trouble and yours. Stannis agreed to let me bring a detachment north to meet the relief convoy from the wall. And look who else I found on the road." He jerked a thumb behind him. Emerging from the line of black brothers was a figure in dark armor, the hilt of a Valyrian steel sword rising from his scabbard. Jon Snow. Ygritte's breath caught in her throat. He stood tall, the wind tousling his black hair. Their eyes met across the smoke and torchlight, and for a moment, Ygritte forgot the cold, the fear, all of it. He was at her side in a few strides, scanning her for injuries. "You're alive," he murmured, almost incredulous. "I was told you went out searching for Mance." She rolled her eyes, though her expression was softened by relief. I found him. You heard about the white attack." Jon nodded, taking in the ragged survivors, Mance included. "We came as quickly as we could. The watchers at the wall intercepted a raven from Stannis. Said you rode north. We formed a relief force, Night's Watch volunteers and free folk, and pressed on through the storms." He glanced around, eyes lingering on the carnage. Almost too late. Ygritte allowed herself to lean against him, just for a moment, ignoring the wary stares from some of the nearby knights and free folk. But not quite. Her side ached fiercely, but she could bear it. "We're lucky you came when you did." Tormund clapped Jon on the back. "Lucky indeed. The crows proved their worth today." He eyed the battered group who had fought from below. "Though you gave the whites a taste of steel yourselves." Jon crouched by Mance, who sat propped against a rock, too weak to stand. Their gazes met, and an unspoken tension passed between them. Mance had once called Jon a turncloak. Jon had once betrayed Mance's trust. Yet now they shared the same cause, preserving the living. "Lord Commander," Mance said, voice faintly mocking. "Come to drag me back to a cell?" Jon shook his head. "No, I came to save as many as I could." He paused. "I'm glad you're alive, Mance." Mance managed a crooked smile. "You're more like your father than you know." Ygritte felt a pang at that remark, recalling how little Jon ever truly knew of Ned Stark's deeper mind. She helped Mance to his feet, while Tormund and a pair of black brothers steadied him from either side. The wounded and exhausted survivors gathered around, relieved murmurs blending with occasional sobs from those who discovered lost friends among the corpses. Jon took stock of the situation, conferring with Ser Brendel and Tormund. "We'll combine forces. With so many men, we can attempt the climb out of the ravine. We'll make slow progress in the dark, but staying here is too dangerous. There could be more whites lurking." Ygritte weighed the risk of traveling by night. Then she remembered how close they had come to annihilation. We move," she agreed. "I'll help Mance. Some of these folks can walk, some can't." And so began the arduous ascent. Torches lit the way as men and women hauled themselves up the slope, sometimes crawling on hands and knees. The battered horses had scattered during the battle, but a few were recovered, trembling and spooked. Ygritte and Jon walked near the rear, supporting Mance. Tormund led from the front, shouting encouragement and curses at anyone who faltered. At the top, the rest of Jon's party waited with more torches and blankets. Ygritte's numb fingers could barely grip the rope they'd rigged as a makeshift handhold. Every muscle screamed in protest as she hauled herself and Mance upward. When they finally reached even ground, she slumped against Jon, breath clouding in the cold air. The joined force set about tending to the wounded, distributing whatever meager supplies they had. On that bleak ridge, with the dead behind them and the uncertain night ahead, a sense of unity took hold. Knights and free folk, crows and spearwives, all had fought side by side to emerge alive. One of the Black brothers, a lanky man called Lark, muttered to Jon, "We have to head back soon, Lord Commander. The men at Castle Black can't afford for us to stay away too long. The others are stirring everywhere." Ygritte heard and felt a new wave of worry. There was no safe place in the north now. Winterfell was in peril. The wall was under threat. Whites prowled the wilderness. She glanced at Jon. "What do we do now?" He ran a hand through his hair, fatigue etched into his features. "We bring Mance and these survivors back to Winterfell. Then I lead my men back to the wall, or at least send some on ahead. We can't stay scattered. If the White Walkers make a real push, we need every advantage we can manage. And we need the North united." Tormund snorted. "Easier said than done, Crow." "Too true," Jon agreed, voice dry. "But we do what we must." They pressed on, forging south through the night as best they could, guided by those who knew the land. Ygritte walked close to Jon, leaning on him when her side flared. She felt his steady warmth in the biting cold, remembered the nights they had shared in the wilderness, when the world seemed large and uncertain, but not quite as doomed as it did now. At dawn, they found shelter in a ring of fir trees, the canopies thick enough to keep the snow from burying them. A few men collapsed where they stood, dead on their feet from exhaustion. Jon ordered watch shifts, making sure no one froze to death in sleep. Ygritte and Mance settled near a small fire, Tormund on Mance's other side. Jon joined them briefly, crouching to speak in low tones. "Mance, once you've recovered, Stannis will want to see you. But I'll do what I can to keep him from trying to punish you again," Jon said quietly. Mance let out a rasping chuckle. "I've grown used to kings. They never know quite what to do with me. But I'll stand by your side if it means saving our people." Jon looked at him, something like gratitude in his eyes. "If the free folk follow you, and you stand with us at the wall, that might be enough to sway the north. They're afraid of wildlings, yes, but they're even more afraid of the dead." "They have every reason," Ygritte put in softly. "We've seen what waits in the darkness." Tormund shifted his weight, toying with the edge of his fur cloak. Then let's hope Stannis can rally the northern lords. Because if he can't, we'll all be marching to our dooms soon enough. Jon's gaze flicked to Ygritte, a silent vow in his dark eyes. She read it clearly. We'll find a way. We have to. They reached Winterfell after another brutal march nearly a week later. The storms were unrelenting, forcing them to shelter in abandoned huts or behind earthen banks wherever they could find minimal cover. More than once, they had to fend off roving packs of desperate men. Bolton sympathizers or plain outlaws, it was never entirely clear. But the presence of Tormund and Jon's black brothers, along with the knights, deterred most would-be attackers. Mance grew stronger with each passing day, though the cold had gnawed at him badly. The other survivors from his group, now folded into Jon's force, bore the look of haunted souls who had seen too much death. And yet, step by grueling step, they made progress. By the time the grand towers of Winterfell emerged through a curtain of blowing snow, their number had diminished slightly. A few had perished from illness or exhaustion. Yet seeing those ramparts, battered as they were, brought hope flickering in Ygritte's chest. The castle gates creaked open to admit them, revealing the slushy, frozen courtyard beyond. Stannis met them in the yard, flanked by Melisandre and a handful of his knights. He looked neither pleased nor displeased, but grimly resigned to the rigors of this winter campaign. As Mance Rayder was helped from his horse, Stannis stepped forward. "You return from the jaws of death, it seems," the king said, voice echoing in the still air. "Aye, thanks to Jon Snow," Mance replied. His posture was unbowed, though he still leaned on Tormund's arm. "We lost too many. The Whites took our wagons. But we live." Stannis regarded him impassively, then turned to Jon. "Lord Commander, your presence here is unexpected. Have you abandoned the wall?" Jon shook his head. "No, your grace. I brought volunteers, both watch and free folk, to rescue Mance and others. The dead are everywhere. If we don't unite, this winter will bury us." Melisandre stepped closer, her red robes almost luminous against the white surroundings. "The flames showed me this meeting," she murmured. "Many paths converging. The living must stand together or fall." Stannis seemed unmoved by prophecy. "I see you have succeeded in that effort, at least for now. Come inside before we all freeze." They followed him into the great hall, which had been partially restored. Fires burned in two large hearths. The air was smoky and pungent, but far warmer than outside. Ygritte let out a trembling breath of relief as the heat seeped into her numb fingers. Mance was given a seat near the fire, and Tormund took another. Jon and Ygritte stood behind them, flanked by a mix of black brothers and free folk. Stannis, Davos Seaworth, and Melisandre faced them. "We've managed to hold Winterfell," Stannis began. "The Boltons are scattered. Roose Bolton was slain, and his bastard Ramsay fell soon after. But pockets of resistance remain across the north. Some lesser lords have bent the knee to me. Others hide behind their walls, waiting. This is no easy conquest, but my men do what they can to keep order." He paused, his gaze sweeping the newcomers. "You have arrived with more survivors. That is good, if they will aid our cause. But winter is upon us in earnest. Our supplies run low. We cannot feed many more mouths unless we secure the countryside or receive shipments from White Harbor, the last major port. And the storms have blocked roads in every direction. The ships that braved the seas to Eastwatch can hardly cross the land from there to here." Mance exhaled slowly. "We have some experience with winter, your grace, though we typically move as needed. Huddling in a castle is not our way. But if the free folk are to survive, we might need to adapt. My people will hunt, gather, do what it takes to pull their weight, if you let them roam freely." Stannis's jaw tightened. "Freely. That is a word the free folk enjoy. Yet I cannot have you raiding nearby villages or angering lords who might yet join me." Mance's eyes flicked to Jon. "Perhaps the new Lord Commander can vouch for us. We have no interest in reaving the local folk if it means forging a real alliance. We only want to survive, same as you." Jon met Stannis's stern gaze. Your Grace, you need the free folk as much as they need you. They can gather resources beyond the roads, in forests and hills you might not even know. They have a knack for survival that your soldiers lack. In exchange, let them share in Winterfell's security. Let them settle some of the outlying holdfasts if need be. Stannis stood silent for a long moment. Davos cleared his throat, offering a quiet remark. We cannot fight the real war alone, my king. The north is too large, and the weather too harsh. At last, Stannis nodded curtly. Very well. Mance Rayder, Tormund Giantsbane, you will see that your people abide by the rules I set or face my wrath. In return, you will be granted limited freedom to roam, to hunt, to gather, but not to burn or pillage. The lords under my banner must see you as allies, not marauders. Tormund grinned widely. Long as they don't strike first, we'll keep the peace. Mance lifted a hand. Done. Perhaps the day will come when we no longer call each other free folk and kneelers, but that day is not yet. For now, let's just focus on living. Ygritte exhaled a small breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. This accord might be tenuous, but it was something. She glanced at Jon, who gave her a faint nod. A stepping stone, nothing more, yet it could mean the difference between life and death when the walkers finally made their push. Melisandre's quiet voice broke the moment. The storm grows stronger, yet the fires warn that the enemy gathers as well. The wall will be tested soon. King Stannis, Lord Commander, the time to unify is now. Stannis's mouth pressed into a thin line. Then unify we shall, and see if the North can be roused from its slumber. He dismissed them with a wave, striding out to confer with his knights about the next steps. Davos followed close behind, though he offered Jon a small, encouraging nod. Melisandre lingered, her red-gloved hands resting on the back of a chair, watching Ygritte with an unreadable expression before she too turned and followed Stannis. Ygritte helped Mance to his feet. Tormund made a loud remark about finding ale, though he grimaced at the watery brew the Southerners provided. Some of the free folk drifted away, eager for warmth, rest, or food. The Black brothers gathered near Jon, quietly discussing the journey back. Suddenly, Ygritte felt Jon's hand on her shoulder, steering her aside. He guided her to a quieter spot near the hall's side, where a smaller hearth gave off a gentle glow. "Let me look at that wound," he said. She started to protest, but realized how exhausted she was, how the bandage beneath her furs was stained red-brown. She hissed softly as Jon gently pulled back the layers, revealing a half-healed gash that had reopened during the frantic climb out of the ravine. He exhaled sharply, rummaging for a clean cloth to dab away the dried blood. "You're as stubborn as ever," he murmured, though concern laced his words. "Fighting whites and climbing ravines with a wound like that." She mustered a smirk. "I've had worse." Then softer, "But I'm glad you came when you did." He pressed the cloth gently, his brown eyes flicking up to meet hers. "I received word you'd gone north, but I couldn't be sure of the danger." The message was vague. Still, it was enough to spur me to gather volunteers. We left Castle Black in a hurry, trusting the men left behind would hold. We had no time to lose. "You put yourself at risk leaving the wall," she said, though the gratitude in her voice was clear. "But you saved us." He glanced away, guilt shadowing his features. "I had to. I couldn't let you die out there." Ygritte's heart squeezed in her chest. Gently, she placed a hand on his, feeling the roughness of his glove. "I'm not dead yet, Jon Snow." A flicker of a smile touched his lips. "No, you're not." They lingered there, the warmth of the hearth on their faces. The world beyond the hall was still bitterly cold, the dead a looming threat, the north caught in a swirl of uncertainty. But in that moment, with the battle behind them, they allowed themselves a brief, quiet closeness. Then footsteps approached. Dolorous Ed, clearing his throat apologetically. "Beg pardon, Lord Commander. The men are asking for you. They're not sure how long we can remain here before heading back." Jon withdrew from Ygritte, setting down the cloth. "I'll be there in a moment." He turned to her, a regretful note in his voice. "Duty." She nodded, biting back a sigh. Duty, she echoed. Go on, then. He squeezed her hand once, then joined Ed, crossing the hall to consult with the Black brothers about their next steps. Ygritte watched him go, a swirl of emotion in her chest. She felt a sudden ache, not just physical but deeper, the longing for a life without these constant separations, these never-ending wars. But that was not the world they lived in. When he had gone, Tormund ambled up, an ale horn in one hand. Seems you and the crow are thick as thieves again, he teased, his voice lower than usual. Careful, or he'll have you wearing his black cloak. She snorted. Keep your jests, Tormund. We both have our duties. He took a swig of ale, grimacing at the taste. I suppose we do. Hard to believe we're all crammed into these cold stone walls, waiting for a bigger storm to hit. If you told me a year ago that I'd be relying on kneelers to survive, I'd have pissed on your feet. It's a strange world, she admitted, but we're still breathing. That's more than many can say. Tormund nodded, gaze drifting across the hall where free folk and southern knights eyed each other with equal parts suspicion and wariness. We live. For now. He leaned closer, dropping his voice. But I worry this alliance is weaker than a half-thawed ice bridge. The moment real trouble comes, who do you think these lords will stand with? Us, or their precious king and old ways? They'll stand with themselves, Ygritte said wryly. But that's why we have to keep talking, keep proving we can be allies. Jon believes we can do it. Mance is willing to try. It might be enough. Tormund grunted. Or we'll all freeze to death before the others ever get here. She gave him a hard look. Don't you go all gloomy on me, Tormund. That's Ed's job. He erupted in a booming laugh that drew looks from across the hall. For a brief instant, Ygritte felt the tension ease. No matter how dire things became, Tormund's spirit refused to be fully broken. Nearby, Mance was speaking quietly with a few free folk elders who had trickled into Winterfell after hearing that the castle was open to them. Some had families in tow, shivering children wrapped in furs. Mance listened, nodding, his posture upright again despite his exhaustion. As king beyond the wall in all but name, he bore the responsibility of guiding them. That day, Winterfell bustled with a subdued energy. Small squads of free folk ventured into the surrounding woods, accompanied by a knight or two, searching for game. Others explored the castle's half-ruined corridors, scrounging for anything that might be used for fuel or repairs. The Black brothers who had arrived with Jon rested and resupplied, while Jon conferred with Stannis about how soon he could depart for Castle Black and what portion of men, if any, could be spared to reinforce the wall. In the evening, a biting wind battered the castle, rattling shutters and howling through stone passages. Ygritte found a corner of the great hall to catch some sleep, but found herself restless. She wandered the corridors instead, crossing paths with a few men on guard duty. One free folk warrior, perched near an arrow slit, told her he saw shapes moving in the dark, but it turned out to be a pack of wolves sniffing around the outer walls. The memory of dire wolves and the old tales of House Stark flickered through Ygritte's mind. Eventually, she stepped outside into the courtyard, bracing against the cold. The sky was scattered with hard, silver stars. The moon cast a pale glow over the snowdrifts. She imagined Jon somewhere else in the castle, perhaps meeting with Stannis or helping to draft ravens. She wondered if he, too, ever wished they could steal away for a moment, forget all this. Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice. Can't sleep. She turned to see Mance approaching with slow, careful steps, wearing a patched cloak that trailed behind him. He still looked worn, but there was a stubborn vitality in his eyes. Ygritte shook her head. Too much on my mind. You? He stopped beside her, following her gaze up to the moonlit battlements. My mind's been spinning for days. Visions of whites, the sound of wind through those twisted forests. Even in these walls, I can't find real rest. She nodded, understanding. They say we're safe here, but we both know how quickly that can change. Mance lifted a hand, gesturing to the structures around them. Winterfell, an ancient seat of power. Once it belonged to the Starks, still does in name, maybe, Now it's ours or Stannis's, or the free folks, or the North's. None of it feels certain. But if we can weather the storms here, maybe we have a chance. The day you convinced me to accept Stannis's terms, I thought I was signing away the free folks' pride. But I see now, pride alone won't save us from the others. Ygritte studied him in the faint light. Jon said the same. He said we have to break old barriers. Mance gave a soft laugh. He's got a knack for that, doesn't he? Breaking barriers he never asked for. He was born that way, I think. The bastard son who never fit perfectly into the southern mold. Nor ours. Maybe that's why he can see both sides. Maybe that's why he loves you. Ygritte's cheeks warmed, despite the cold. She lowered her gaze. Mance had a way of reading the unspoken. She remembered when Jon first came among them as a spy, how Mance had accepted him, at least for a time. There was a respect there that had not entirely died, even after Jon's perceived betrayal. She exhaled softly, her breath steaming in the moonlight. I suppose so. Silence settled between them, not awkward, just thoughtful. At length, Mance rested a hand on her shoulder. I'm proud of you, Spear Wife. You've done more for our people than you ever expected. Keep doing it. The free folk will need your voice. She glanced at him, touched by the sincerity in his tired eyes. She remembered the many nights they had sung songs around the free folks' fires, how Mance had once dazzled them with music from both sides of the wall. I will, she promised, long as I can. They parted ways, Mance returning inside to find some rest, Ygritte lingering for a moment longer. She listened to the wind moan across the courtyard, carrying with it the faint echoes of a distant world. There were times she wished the whole realm could share a single campfire, so they could see each other's faces in the glow, see that they were all just people, just men and women trying to survive the cold. Maybe that was too idealistic, but if they ever had a chance of seeing the dawn after the long night, it would require some measure of unity. At length, she headed back into the castle, finding her way to a quiet alcove near the great hall. Curling up on a bench, she let her weary body sink into an uneasy sleep. Morning came slowly, a pale wash of light seeping through clouded skies. The weather had warmed slightly, enough to turn the upper layer of snow to slush, making footing treacherous in the courtyard. Ygritte woke stiff and sore, her side throbbing. She rose, rummaging for a bite of stale bread from a supply crate. A handful of men already roamed the yard, stamping their feet to keep warm. Jon found her soon enough. He approached with a purposeful stride, face set in a thoughtful expression. We're to depart, he announced. Her heart gave a small lurch. Depart for the wall? He nodded. I can't delay any longer. Word from the remaining garrison says Whites attacked again, this time near Queensgate. They were repelled, but only just. I need to be there in case a larger force assaults. I'd hoped Stannis might come as well, but he says he can't leave Winterfell yet. The lords are drifting away. If he's not here, the whole thing might collapse. Ygritte absorbed that. You'll go alone? He shook his head. No. I have a contingent of Black brothers, plus some free folk who volunteered. Tormund and Mance will stay at Winterfell for now. Stannis trusts them, if only a little, and they'll help keep the peace. But a handful of your folk asked to come north with me to defend the wall. You could too, if you wish. Her breath caught. Part of her wanted to stand beside Jon, to see that battered ice fortress once more, to help repel the dead from the only barrier that might save them all. But she pictured the wounded, starving free folk in Winterfell, the uneasy truce that might crumble without enough voices bridging the gap. Tormund was a formidable presence, but he could not speak calmly to kneelers. Mance was still recovering his strength, and he was widely distrusted. Ygritte herself had gained a certain standing, especially after the role she played in forging peace at Castle Black and facilitating these rescues. Maybe that was where she was truly needed. She found her gaze lingering on the black collar of Jon's cloak, worn from travel and singed at the edges. She wanted nothing more than to ride with him, but, I think I should remain, she said softly. Winterfell needs someone who can talk sense to the free folk and the kneelers, to keep them from each other's throats. Jon reached for her hand, weaving his fingers through hers. "I understand." They stood close, ignoring the glances from a few passers-by. The vow of the Night's Watch forbade marriage, children, attachments that might distract from duty. But the old rules were fraying in the face of an apocalypse. No one could truly gainsay the Lord Commander if he chose to share a moment of closeness with a spearwife who had fought to save them all. "When the time comes," he said, voice low, "and the others march in force, you'll come north, won't you? Alongside the rest." She squeezed his hand. "Aye. When the final battle comes, we'll stand together. I promise." He pressed his forehead to hers for a brief, tender moment. Then he pulled away, that determined set returning to his features. "I have to gather the men, see if we can find fresh mounts. The roads aren't any better than before, but at least we know the way." She forced a small smile. "Safe journey, Jon Snow. Don't get yourself killed." He allowed a hint of a grin. "I'll do my best." With that, he turned and strode across the courtyard, calling out instructions to a group of black brothers who were saddling horses. Dolorous Ed, unsettled as ever, muttered complaints about the weather. Some free folk carried bundles of arrows or small kegs of dragonglass. Ygritte watched them prepare, a tightening in her chest. She wished circumstances were different. She wished she could ride at Jon's side again, the way they once did. But she had found her place here, bridging the gap within Winterfell. Soon, Mance and Tormund appeared to bid Jon farewell. Stannis stood at a distance, flanked by Davos and a handful of knights, observing with a cool expression. Possibly he disapproved of the Lord Commander's departure or simply distrusted Mance's presence. The thick tension in the air did not deter the departing men. They mounted up with difficulty, horses stamping in the slushy ground. Jon exchanged curt words with Tormund, some final arrangement about free folk supply runs. Then he turned to Mance. The two men eyed each other, old animosity and new understanding mingling in the space between them. Jon offered his hand. Mance, after a moment's hesitation, took it. "Keep them alive," Jon said. "We'll need everyone soon." Mance's lips twitched into a faint smirk. "I'll do what I can, Crow. Try not to lose that wall before I get there." Jon snorted softly, then his gaze flicked to Ygritte one last time. She gave him a nod, swallowing the lump in her throat. With a final command, Jon spurred his horse and led the column out of Winterfell, into the swirling white. The gates clanged shut behind them. Ygritte stood a moment longer, her breath rattling in her chest. So many times she had watched Jon depart, uncertain if she'd see him again. Each time cut deeper than the last. But at least now, their parting was not one of betrayal or misunderstanding. They stood on the same side, forging an alliance that the realm had never seen before. A cause that might redeem the tragedies that had befallen them. "Best get indoors," Tormund said, clapping her shoulder. "You'll freeze out here, dreaming about your crow." She nudged him with an elbow, forcing a laugh. "I could say the same to you, big man." They trudged back toward the keep, passing Stannis and his retinue. The king paid them no particular attention, busy conferring with Davos about the next shipments of grain and the possibility of contacting White Harbor. Ygritte wondered how long Stannis would cling to Winterfell if the North's lords remained lukewarm to his cause. She wondered if that even mattered, given that the real war would soon overshadow all the rest. Inside, the corridors bustled with a strange mix of Southerners and free folk. The great hall was filled with small clusters of families around the hearths, as well as knights sipping thin ale, scribes transcribing messages to send by raven. Ygritte spotted the children of some free folk families huddled near the fires, wide-eyed at the size of the castle. It still struck her sometimes, how their world had changed. Once mortal enemies, now thrown together to escape a greater doom. In the days that followed, Ygritte busied herself keeping that fragile peace. She intervened when a group of free folk hunters returned with a couple of scrawny sheep taken from a local farm, where the knight in charge of the farm insisted they had no right. She persuaded him to compromise, offering a portion of the sheep in exchange for some winter vegetables the free folk had gathered. Each small argument might have erupted into violence if left unattended, But slowly, warily, people began to trust that they could negotiate instead of fight. Meanwhile, Tormund led parties out into the surrounding forests, bringing back small hauls of game. He was relentless, refusing to let men wallow in laziness or despair. Mance, still nursing his health, used his reputation to rally the free folk, reminding them that they were a proud people who thrived under hardship. He told them tales of the Frostfangs, of the monstrous cold they had survived before. Here, at least, they had walls and a chance to rebuild. From Stannis' side, Ser Davos Seaworth took the lead in bridging the gap with local lords, riding out with a handful of men to treat with scattered holds. Sometimes he returned successful, carrying small wagons of supplies from a lesser house that decided to support Stannis' claim. Other times he came back empty-handed, faced with fear and distrust. But his perseverance was remarkable. Ygritte found herself respecting the Onion Knight's calm resolve. One twilight, as Ygritte helped oversee the distribution of the day's meager rations, she heard a horn sound from outside the gates. A single, low note. It wasn't the triple blast that signaled whites, but an arrival of some sort. She and Tormund hurried to the courtyard, where a handful of riders approached under a flag of House Mormont, a black bear on a green field. Leading them was a tall woman with a face carved in stern lines, wearing a heavy cloak pinned by a small golden bear. Behind her rode a retinue of grim-faced warriors. Ygritte recognized the grit in their bearing. These were people who had lived hard on Bear Island. One of them carried a chest strapped across his saddle. They halted near the middle of the yard, where a few knights hurried forth to greet them. Ygritte could hear snippets of conversation, something about gifts for the rightful king. She stepped closer, curious. Tormund was at her side, quietly watchful. "King Stannis is within," a knight was saying. "Lord Commander Jon Snow rode north some days past. What news from Bear Island?" The tall woman dismounted, shaking out her cloak. "I am Alysanne Mormont, cousin to the Lady of Bear Island. We bring what stores we can spare, as a sign of our support." Her gaze swept over the courtyard, lingering on free folk who peered from corners. "We hear you harbor wildlings within Winterfell now." Tormund squared his broad shoulders. "We're free folk, woman, not wildlings." Alysanne studied him with cool interest. "You fought the Boltons, I hear." "That we did," Tormund replied, no trace of fear in his tone. A small nod from her. "Then you're worth more than rumors said. We Mormonts remember that House Stark defended us when others would not. If the free folk now fight for the same cause, so be it." Stannis arrived shortly thereafter, stepping out into the swirl of frost-laced air. He inclined his head to the newcomers. Alysanne Mormont recounted how Bear Island had heard of the Boltons' defeat and how they recognized Stannis' claim only because he held Winterfell in the name of the late King Robb Stark. She handed over the supplies: salted fish, barrels of preserved berries, furs. It wasn't a large shipment, but enough to bolster their stores for a time. Ygritte watched from the sidelines, impressed by the stoic generosity of these island warriors. They might not love Stannis, but they loved the idea of the North freed from traitors. Perhaps the alliance was growing. Perhaps the battered realm still had hearts willing to stand against the winter. For the first time in weeks, she felt a small surge of optimism. But that night, a raven arrived from Castle Black, shattering any illusion of safety. The scroll, penned in Samwell Tarly's careful hand, described new attacks by whites up and down the wall, from Eastwatch to the Shadow Tower. A particularly fierce assault on Castle Black itself had left a dozen Black brothers dead, with more injured. They had driven the whites back, but the losses were grim. Jon Snow was unhurt, the note said, but it was only a matter of time before the White Walkers struck in greater force. Ygritte read the missive by torchlight, her pulse pounding. She could picture Jon there, exhausted, battered, standing atop the wall to rally his men. She might have been a help, with her bow and knowledge of free folk tactics. Instead, she was here in Winterfell tending to daily squabbles. She breathed slowly, reminding herself that uniting the North was also vital. Stannis, after reading the Raven's contents, announced to his assembled court, an odd mixture of knights, free folk, and northern warriors, that he was considering a sortie north to assist the watch. But the lords who had begun trickling in with support urged caution, reminding him that the Bolton's remnants and other enemies might retake Winterfell if he marched away. With the roads nearly impassable in some stretches, a prolonged absence could cost him everything he'd gained. The entire alliance threatened to unravel into endless debate. In the midst of it, Ygritte rose to speak, surprising even herself. She glanced at Tormund, who gave her a nod of encouragement. Then she addressed the hall, her voice carrying in the hush. "Your Grace, lords, free folk, you've been told about the White Walkers. Some of you have seen them. Others may think them stories. I faced them. I fought the Whites, lost friends to them. They're real, and they're coming for us all." She paused, scanning the skeptical faces. "So hear me. If we let the wall fall, we die anyway. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon enough. If the crows can't hold the gate, the others will pour through and freeze the heart of this land. Winterfell won't matter, your titles won't matter. Everything will be ash and ice." Her words hung in the still air. Stannis regarded her, arms folded. A few of the northern knights exchanged uneasy glances. Alysanne Mormont's face was grim, as though she understood more than the others. Tormund stood behind Ygritte, hands resting on the head of his axe, silent support. "How many can we spare?" Stannis said at length, looking to Davos. "Could we send a contingent north to reinforce Castle Black, while maintaining hold here?" Davos ran a hand over his bearded jaw. "We might, your grace, but our numbers are thin as it is. If we weaken ourselves too much, the castle becomes vulnerable. The snows alone might trap a smaller garrison here, easy prey for any marauders." Stannis turned back to Ygritte. "These are the realities, Spearwife. I do not doubt your warning. But if I lose Winterfell, the North will never rally to me." She clenched her fists. "Then send some, enough to help the crows hold until spring. If there is a spring, keep the rest here if you must. But you can't leave Jon and the others to fend for themselves." A tense silence followed. At last, Alysanne Mormont spoke up. "Bear Island does not fear winter. We have 100 good warriors with us, back on our ships, those that remain. Let me take a portion of them north to Castle Black to fight beside the Night's Watch. The rest will stay with King Stannis. We'll not abandon our responsibilities." Stannis arched an eyebrow. "You would do this?" Alysanne squared her shoulders. "House Mormont remembers the old ways. We keep our vows to the north, and the Starks swore themselves to defend the realm. If the dead truly gather, the Watch must be helped." Mance Rayder, standing near Tormund, spoke up as well. "Some free folk might go with her, enough to stiffen the defense. We don't need many here, as Tormund has said. Just enough to hunt, gather, and keep these walls from fracturing. The rest can do real good at the wall." Stannis's stern features betrayed no emotion, but he glanced at Davos, who inclined his head. The king addressed the hall. "Very well. A portion of House Mormont's warriors will sail or ride to Eastwatch if possible, then move to Castle Black. A portion of the free folk may join them if Mance can spare them. We will keep enough men here to hold Winterfell. Let us pray the storms do not swallow our efforts." A ripple of agreement passed through the assembled crowd. Ygritte felt something inside her unwind, just a little. They were sending help. It wasn't everything, but it might tip the balance in Jon's favor. She caught Tormund's eye. He gave a slow nod, a silent acknowledgement that this was the best they could do for now. She raised her voice again. "I'll go with them." Tormund's mouth quirked in surprise. "You just said." "I know what I said," Ygritte interrupted. "But the free folk who go north might need me. Jon might need me. Mance will stay here, so will you. But I can fight. I can rally them. Let me do this." She felt eyes on her from every direction. Stannis seemed indifferent, so long as it did not conflict with his plans. Mance looked thoughtful. Tormund placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. "Are you certain? You're wound." "I'll manage," she said firmly. "I'm tired of sitting on the sidelines, Tormund. If the dead are attacking the wall, I won't wait here for the day they break through. Mance regarded her a moment, then nodded. We'll be sorry to lose your voice here, but if you're determined, I won't stop you. Stannis turned to Alysanne Mormont. Are you willing to have this woman among your ranks? Alysanne looked Ygritte up and down, noting the bandage still hidden under layers of clothing, the bow strapped to her back. If she can fight whites, she is welcome. I'll not turn down a good archer. Ygritte felt a surge of relief and a flutter of nervous excitement. She was going back north to the wall to Jon. Part of her wondered if this was fate or folly. But she couldn't remain in Winterfell while the war for the living raged on the very doorstep of the Seven Kingdoms. That night, plans were laid out. Alysanne Mormont would send a raven to Bear Island, instructing her warriors to sail or travel by land as quickly as the storms permitted. They would gather near Eastwatch, where a small port might still be navigable, or else simply ride the coast. A contingent of free folk, about 50 strong, would join them. Ygritte would go as a guide, bridging any hostility that might arise between the House Mormont warriors and the free folk. Melisandre offered ominous words of caution about storms in the Shivering Sea, but Stannis waved her aside, focused on consolidating his hold on Winterfell. Tormund, Mance, and Ygritte spent one last evening together in the Great Hall, seated around a small table near the hearth. They spoke in low voices of what might come. Another long separation, more battles, the uncertain future. Tormund teased Ygritte about her eagerness to see Jon, but there was genuine concern beneath his jests. "Watch your back," he rumbled. "I won't be there to crack skulls if some kneeler tries to backstab you." "I'll watch it," she promised. Mance offered a faint smile. "Give the Night's Watch my regards, and tell Jon Snow. Well, tell him I plan on returning to the wall eventually, but he'd best not break it before I get there." She bowed her head in acknowledgement, an odd swirl of fondness and worry in her chest. "He'll hold as long as it takes." Morning dawned, a milky haze over Winterfell. Ygritte joined Alysanne and her retinue in the courtyard, alongside the free folk who had volunteered. They looked determined, if a bit anxious. Sleds and wagons were loaded with supplies, salted fish, furs, dragonglass arrowheads. Stannis came to see them off, standing by the gates, his breath pluming in the cold. "Go quickly and return if you can. We may still have need of you here," the king said, though he sounded distracted. Likely he was already planning his next move to secure the loyalty of other northern houses. Ygritte, mounted on a sturdy northern garron, glanced over her shoulder at Winterfell's gate one last time. Somewhere inside, Tormund and Mance would be forging new bonds between the free folk and the battered remains of the North. She prayed they succeeded. Everyone's lives hung on these fragile alliances. She clucked her tongue, and her horse lurched forward, following Alysanne's lead. The column of riders and supply-laden sleds trudged out through the gate, forging northward once more. The wind bit at her cheeks, but she lifted her chin, welcoming the cold. She was done waiting. Ahead lay Eastwatch, the sea, and then Castle Black. Jon, the White Walkers, the war for the living. A fresh wave of determination coursed through her. This was where she belonged. In the thick of it, arrow knocked, side by side with those who would not yield to the darkness. If the realm had any hope, it lay in the unity she and Jon had fought so hard to kindle, though the rest of the world seemed blind to the gathering night. She bowed her head against the wind and pressed on. The road was long, the future uncertain, but her path was clear. Fight for the living, guide the free folk, and stand with Jon Snow when the final darkness descended. She would see it done no matter the cost. And so she rode, heart burning with the fierce resolve of a spearwife who had cheated death once before, determined to do so again if it meant saving the only world she had ever known.